Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Nancy, let's not start this fight with you. You know how much I love you, but your behavior makes me wonder about the legacy. What are you and Noah supposed to get? Mason pounded the table and fixed his cold gaze on his daughter. She kept her eyes averted from her father's dark abyss and tried to stand her ground, lest she show weakness. She had become so confident in her 25 years that even the family sometimes obeyed this young person. Don't you dare talk to me about money. I don't want it from you, or Grandma, or Noah. You're making me do something I don't want to do. The blonde girl who had tried so desperately to stand up to her father spoke through her teeth. You can never force me to work for your company. The Smith family is one of the most powerful in Street Petersburg. And all credit to Smith for building his empire so hard over the years. He's dead now, but his children and his wife, who owns most of the stock in the business. Molly was always sweet to her grandchildren and her sons, even though they visited her quite infrequently. She lived alone and felt homesick for her family, but never disturbed her children for nothing, knowing they already had families of their own. I'll send you to your grandmother to settle down, Lisa, Mason said, and left the table. Two pairs of eyes stared in surprise, and the third looked at her father fiercely through the doorway. Nancy clutched the edge of the tablecloth, which had been perfectly laid out as early as this morning. A rough hand lay on the back of Nancy's palm, and she slowly raised her eyes to her brother. You know that no matter what happens, I will always be on your side. Noah moved closer to his sister, and Tanya said, I'd actually be happy to run away from this damned house to somewhere in England or Italy. As long as our father's alive, he'll never let us out of his clutches, which I'm sick of. He's cutting off my air with his surveillance. Nancy ventured, as if not noticing her mother beside her, who looked so sadly at the children. Don't say that about your father, dear. You know he cares for us, Cindy said, and lowered her eyes to the floor. Many people had admired this woman in her day. They were amazed that she could conquer Smith himself. She had fought everyone with her unearthly beauty. Her snow-white skin, eyes as black as coal, and incredibly golden curly hair. The twins Nancy and Noah probably looked more like their mother than their father. Cindy was a quiet but very commanding and elegant woman, until her children grew up. Mom, at least stay out of it. I should have stayed out of it when my father forced me into medical school, Nancy muttered, turning to his mother over his shoulder, defending her husband all you want. But he won't stop being a tyrant in my eyes. Your family is suffocating me. Noah shook his sister's hand again, hoping she would pull herself together. The two of them had an insanely strong bond. They were born on the same day and had been together for the entire 9 months they were in their mother's womb. Even though they were completely different, neither of them seemed to be able to exist separately. Nancy was like a time bomb, and Noah was the one who could save the world from that bomb. He was quiet and calm, and she couldn't stand inhibitions and crumbled every boundary she could. The Smith brother and sister were often caught in the lens of journalists' cameras, and the internet dubbed them the perfect twins. Both have fair skin and golden hair, passed down to their mother. Their main feature is their heterotemple, which is quite interestingly placed in their eyes. Nancy's right eye was green and her left blue, while Noah's was exactly the opposite. They were loved by the press for never being stilted, being real, no matter the situation. Do you want James to take over the company when Grandma dies? Cindy blurted out, squinting at her children. She truly didn't understand Nancy's outrage, for she thought that such a life was quite normal. Cindy hated James Smith, her husband's younger brother, with all her heart and soul. And no one over the years had ever understood why this hatred was expressed. Nancy was already seething with anger when Noah was at that moment trying to keep her rage in check. We don't care about the inheritance. When will you realize? Noah said with sharpness in his voice, and then immediately changed his anger into mercy. Mom, we're sick of your sharing. Nancy lost her temper and, drinking a glass of juice, jumped up from her seat and walked away. And her brother, throwing a disapproving glance at her mother, followed her sister, living under the same roof as their parents. At that age, the boys thought it was unseemly, but there was nothing they could do about it. They were completely dependent on their father. And when one of them tried to get a job outside the family company, Mason made sure it didn't happen. It put a strain on Nancy's creative nature, and Noah only wanted his sister to be happy. She secretly drew gorgeous paintings, and in a city like St. Petersburg, she could have developed her creative side. But unfortunately, it was off-limits to her. Cindy was left all alone, looking after the departing children. She hadn't been feeling well lately, but she tried not to show it. In front of the family, "Cindy, are you okay?" Mason approached the woman, placing his large palm on his wife's shoulder. "You look pale." Cindy lowered her eyes and took a deep breath to hold back the flood of tears that accumulated in the corners of her eyes. "I just don't want you all fighting, Mason," the blonde said, and shook her head gravely. It was getting harder and harder for her to hide her poor state of mind. "I want happiness for our family, and you know it. As soon as Molly loses her stock, everything will fall into place," the man said, and kissed his wife on the temple. He was really worried about her, just not as much as he was worried about the inheritance and the business. Smith only smiled warmly and stood up from the table, taking her husband by the forearm. They walked out of the dining room together, again discussing Mason's father's will. Noah squeezed 170 on the speedometer, turning down the main street of the town. Nancy, sitting next to him, nodded occasionally, but only with joy and adrenaline. Such trips gave them vitality. "Whoa!" Nancy shouted as the speeding Noah parked near a small bar. "No one is better at driving than you." The guy smiled and turned off the engine of his brand new Mercedes. The craving for cars was since childhood, and he dreamed of becoming a famous racer. But as practice has shown, all parents of twins want to do is crush their children's dreams as much as possible. "I want to go to the track. I want to feel that adrenaline. It's already at 220. You know, Nancy?" Noah asked, glancing at his sister. She obviously understood him, knew what her twin wanted, but unfortunately there was nothing she could do. The father was going through oxygen in every way possible so that the children would end up being what he wanted them to be. "I'm gonna get us our freedom. Noah, you have my word," Nancy said firmly and held out her hand to her brother. They performed some secret action and smiled at each other. The guy had confidence in his sister and knew that she would still try to get her way. "And now I ran to Sofia. Didn't you miss me?" She poked her brother briefly on the cheek and jumped out of the car so fast he didn't have time to blink an eye. Noah slowly leaned back against the headrests and stared up at the ceiling of the car. His inaction gnawed at him. His sister had always tried, fought with his father, and had even often been punished for it. And he stood back and watched Nancy seek justice. He didn't know what his father's problem was or why he was so desperate to pass his company to them after his death. Inspired by his thoughts, Noah decided to drive to someone who knew exactly the answers to these questions. He started the engine and drove out of the parking lot with a squeal of tires. "Good afternoon, Grandma." He stood on the doorstep of Molly's house and hugged her happily when she asked him to come in. "You've been visiting me more often, Noah. I'm glad." The old woman slowly stroked her grandson's head and began to make tea. "I see you are alone for a reason. You are usually always with your other half." Granny called her grandson and granddaughter indivisible, so she was surprised that only one twin appeared. "I have some questions, for I know you probably won't answer them, but you can help Nancy and I to free ourselves from Father's onslaught," Noah muttered, wanting to know everything that could help him. "I take it that Mason won't stop as much as James." Molly sighed heavily and set a cup of tea and candy in front of her grandson before sitting down next to him. "You still don't know why the brothers aren't communicating and what the problem is with their behavior." Noah shook his head negatively and took a sip of the tea that his grandmother had kindly prepared. He fixed his gaze on the old lady and waited for her story. "You know that your grandfather loved his children madly, but they did not share this paternal love. Mason hated his father's commands and always tried to go against his wishes. James, on the contrary, always tried to please him in order to earn praise. But already more conscious in age, he began to do it not for love and praise, but for money. That your grandfather had. Noah listened attentively to his grandmother. In his will it was stated that after his death, his sons would receive only 15% of the shares, and the remaining 60 shares would go to me. But once my time came, the remaining percentage would go to the son whose children were ready to receive the company and whose children loved their father. That was a prerequisite. And really, I don't even know how that could be notarized. I mean, Dad's trying to make us the best. Compared to Liam and Charles. Noah asked, looking at Molly confused. He wants him to have the company. And James is trying to do the same thing. They're waiting for me to die so they can divide their inheritance, Grandma said, her head down sadly. And you're still young, Grandma. Noah sweetly put his arm around her shoulders and kissed her on the top of her head, which was covered with gray strands of hair. They're too busy with work and power to remember that you're their mother. Molly answered nothing, only stroked her grandson's hand and shook her head. She knew her children were too fond of competing with each other, so she expected a Cold War to break out between her children and grandchildren as soon as her will went into effect. She had long ago realized that her sons only cared about their inheritance, not their own mother's health. Noah chatted with his grandmother some more and hurried to pick Nancy up from the bar to tell her the news of the inheritance and the war between his father and uncle. "Holy shit, did you ever manage to break even?" shrieked Noah, trying to lift his sister off the bar table. "Where's that Kelly of yours? Are you here alone?" "Don't worry, sweetie, I'm here." Turning around, Noah met his gaze with eyes as blue as the ocean. Kelly slowly ran her eyes along the stretched out from her friend's brother's body and occasionally raised her eyebrows admiringly. "And you are, I take it," the praised Noah. "What meeting?" rang out behind Noah's back, and he immediately clamped his jaws shut with anger. Fury filled this harmless guy, and he knew very well who was behind him. He whispered quietly, "Black Mercedes. Take Nancy and wait for me in the car." Nick handed the car keys to Nastya too, and she nodded apprehensively and left the bar, taking her friend under her arm. "And I wanted to say hello to my sister," said the guy, hugging Noah. "How did you go?" "You asshole," Noah growled through gritted teeth, glaring at his uninvited companion. "Noah, we're brothers, aren't we?" It was Liam, James's son, whom Noah hated after he stole a girl right out from under his nose. "If you're still mad about Alina, forget it. She's not my type anymore." Noah clenched his fists and, unable to stand his aggression, punched his cousin in the nose. Liam came in from behind, throwing his head around, blood combining from his nose. "You'll pay for this, bad man," issued Liam, and hurried out of the establishment. "That wench that was with you will soon be mine." Gathering his emotions, Noah got out and hurried to his sister and her friend. Nancy sat in the back seat and grumbled something inaudible, while Kelly tried to wipe her face with a cold, wet washcloth. "She can't go home like that, can she?" Kelly asked, looking at Noah's face. She noticed a strange red spot on his forehead and wrinkled her nose. "Are you all right? Can she stay at your place?" asked Noah. He didn't pay attention to the girl's last question. He was really worried about his sister and how his father would react to her drunken coming home. Kelly nodded and made herself comfortable. "Sit up front, you'll be leading the way." The girl was surprised, but followed the edict and sat forward. They rode in absolute silence. Noah was still angry about the encounter and angry at himself for not being able to keep his temper. He involuntarily squeezed the gas pedal, and the speedometer barred, overturning the number 190. Kelly squirmed in her seat and, without noticing it herself, clutched at Noah's hand that rested on the gearbox. This phrase sweetened the guy, and he, afraid for the girl, braked sharply. "Are you all right? I scared you." Turning his body towards the girl, Noah asked. Kelly's brown hair stuck to her eyes from the harsh breaking, and she slowly turned her face towards the guy. That was actually pretty cool, she smiled, and noticing her hand on Noah's, gave it a quick tug. I can take you for a ride on an abandoned highway outside of town, Noah said with interest, and a quiet snore sounded in the back seat. But first we have to drive this little piggy to get her to call off. The girl smiled and gave him a nervous glance. She obviously liked him. They quickly made their way to Kelly's apartment, and after putting Nancy down, Noah and Kelly got back in the car. So, is Kelly ready? Noah asked, giving the girl an enthusiastic look. She nodded and said, "Can you call me Kelly? I don't really like my full name." They raced through the city streets with the music on full blast, which the girl joined in. They both seemed to be so immersed in the atmosphere that nothing and no one else bothered them. Driving out of town, he didn't stop at the makeshift start line and turned to the girl who was sitting so relaxed next to him. "Have you known Nancy long?" he asked, examining Kelly's face. Her eyes shone even in the dark. Her skin glistened, and were her lips red with coconut. "We met in medical school, socializing, but when we graduated, we started to bond." She sighed heavily. "I like her. Warm and open personality. Reminds me of my sister." "Where's your sister?" Noah's eyes were still on Kelly. "Dead," Kelly answered with a tremor in her voice and exhaled. Once again, a nervous lump formed in her throat. I'm sorry. I wouldn't have brought it up if I had known," Noah stated, lowering his eyes. The girl nodded, and to distract herself, Noah went back to the wheel and pressed the gas pedal a few times to get a feel for the car. "Come on, baby, show me what you can do," whispered the guy, and shifting the speed, rushed forward. With every second, the speed increased. The adrenaline in her blood jumped to an incredible figure, and her heart clenched with fear and pleasure at the same time. Kelly smiled through her apprehension and felt the warmth spill over her body. When the speed reached the maximum, they were flying 220 kilometers per hour on a smooth dark road, which was illuminated only by headlights. This inexpressible sensation filled them both from head to toe. Noah braked and sideways entered the corner, and then with a squeal of tires stopped. "How's that? Smiling at 32?" asked Noah, looking over at the girl. She sat motionless, not taking her eyes off the road ahead, as if she were in a trance from which she didn't want to come out. "It's divine. I want to be like this too." She was breathing heavily, trying to suck in all the air around her. "I'll teach you only next time you're sober." The guy smirked and squeezed the gas pedal again. In the morning, Nancy woke up with a throbbing in her temples and a pressure in the top of her head. Upon getting out of bed, she grabbed her head and gave a frustrated howl at how hard it was for her to just get up. Looking around, she realized she was at Kelly's. But that's how she found herself here. Memory was completely unwilling to prompt Kelly. Shouted Nancy, and then regretted that she had hurt herself unpleasantly with her own voice. A girl entered the room, holding a glass of water and a pill. Grinning, she threw the medicine into the water and held out the glass to her friend. Greedily, she sipped into the glass. Nancy frowned and tried to remember what had happened yesterday. But all in vain. "Why am I here, and how did this happen?" asked Nancy, pulling her cell phone out of the back pocket of her jeans. She hated sleeping in clothes that were outside, but apparently it hadn't really bothered her last night. "You've had quite a bit too much to drink. Noah said you can't go home in that condition, so we brought you to my place. Do you mind?" said Kelly, sitting down on the edge of the bed. Nancy was surprised that Noah was so comfortable leaving her to spend the night with a girl he didn't know at all. Her brother didn't usually leave Nancy alone. They often fought over Noah's overprotective behavior, but here he brought her to a stranger's house and left her there. The girls chatted and later went into the kitchen to have breakfast. Liam Smith was the bad boy in school and in adulthood. James had spent his entire adult life trying to make everything better than his older brother, and that even applied to parenting. He tried to give his sons the best education, values, and a good life. But it turned out they didn't appreciate it at all. Charles, being the older brother, wanted to take over the business after his father died. And that was his only dream. He had no respect for his father and mother and never thought about having a family of his own. All he cared about was money, honor, and power. Liam, on the other hand, was a shadow of his brother, and so he always wanted to get his father's attention with his foolish acts that got him into trouble. You can never reach the heights of Dimitri. Don't even think about me giving you the opportunity to work in our holding company, James blurted out, slapping his hand on the wooden surface of the table. You can't even leave the house without getting into trouble. Liam looked embarrassed, tweaking his recently broken nose with his index finger. He stood in his father's office, eyes downcast, listening to the lecture. But at least this was how he was getting his parents' attention. He couldn't get it through intelligence, work, or good deeds. James only saw the bad in his son. And you're always silent like a rag. Get out, James shouted and sat down in his chair, staring at the papers on his desk. Smith silently turned around and walked out, slamming the door loudly. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he held himself back and made his way to his older brother's room. How are you doing? Daddy's little boy opens the door, Liam said right off his foot. He appeared, having seen the perfect cleanliness of Charles's room. Thick books adorned the wooden shelves on the gray walls of the room, an evenly made bed, and a minimalist style that made Liam sick to his stomach. He thought it was too perfect, and it annoyed him. Do you know what personal space is? No knocking. A gruff voice answered from the corner of the room. Charles sat in a lined black suit, typing something at her laptop. Liam's lip twitched. I haven't been taught. I'm so bad compared to you, growled Smith Jr. as he approached his brother. The latter, without thinking for long, rose from his seat and towered over his brother. He was taller, lighter, by about half a head, and that gave him the advantage of looking down on the other, as if he were really unworthy of him. Yes, you're bad, and you've made that reputation for yourself. Don't blame me for your stupidity, Liam. Then he was cold and imperious. But Liam wouldn't give in. He didn't like to show weakness, but he loved his brother as much as he hated him. You're the good one who makes me so bad. It's your choice. Charles gave him a nervous glance, then, adjusting his tie, pointed a finger at the door. Now go, you can complain to your mother. How insignificant do you think I am, brother? Liam's eyes poured with blood and fury. John clenched his fists. He couldn't hit his brother, but the rising anger beckoned to paint that perfect face with a few abrasions. Lingering, he left his brother's bedroom and walked down to the first floor and went to the gym. It helped him relieve stress and knock out all the hatred he had for his brother and father. James arrived at the office and decided to visit his favorite brother before heading to his office. Apparently, the hatred between the Smith brothers is something bloody. Hello, Mason. James entered the glass room and sat down in the chair directly across from his brother. A smile stretched across the man's face, and he looked at Mason contentedly. Hello, brother. The last word was spoken with a note of snarkiness and a chuckle, which caused James to smile even wider. What brings you to me? We don't seem to have any common projects this month. I want to talk about what's in store for us soon. James put his elbows down on the edge of the table and moved forward. Mom is 60%. You underestimate the tenacity of our mother. She'll outlive you, too. The man grinned, adjusting his collar. He felt a little stuffy. When it came to the inheritance and his unloved mother, I can expedite the process on one condition. Mason's eyes widened. I will help our mother finish as soon as possible, and you will not claim the inheritance. What's my benefit if I don't get that interest? Smith Sr. asked with interest, trying to figure out his brother's secret. I'll give you 20%. By doing so, you will have enough shares to provide for your family for the rest of your life, James concluded. And there was a persistent knock on the door. Both men tensed, and Mason allowed entry. Noah entered the office, glaring angrily at his uncle sitting across from his father. The dislike for James had formed back in the twins' distant childhood, and no one, much like Cindy, knew exactly why. "Son, is something wrong?" Mason asked excitedly. Noah nodded imperceptibly toward his uncle, and his father understood. "James, come on, let's make a deal. We'll solve our problem at lunch." James winked at his brother and hurried out, leaving his son alone with his father. "I want to renounce your inheritance at the notary's office soon," Noah said in one breath. And Mason jumped up. "Are you crazy? What are you talking about?" The shout echoed throughout the office, causing the staff passing the principal to stand up and look in surprise inside the room. Realizing that this was not something worth watching, they moved on. "I don't want your money or your company or anything. You can leave me. If you want to deprive me of what I have now, I'll go ahead and earn it myself." Noah's voice was quite firm, which made his father raise his eyebrows in surprise. Mason knew that Nancy was always combative and easily got into arguments when she knew she was right. But Noah was calmer. But now he was proving that he was indeed a man willing to fight for what was right. "Son, if this is about the last fight with your sister," I said it out of temper, Smith Sr. said excitedly, looking at his son. "I don't want anything to do with the family business." "I'm sure," said Noah. "I'll write a waiver and we'll go to the notary tomorrow." I said all that. The boy left his father's office and headed for the exit with quick steps until he heard a rather interesting conversation nearby. "Are you and the boys? Are you taking her into the woods? She won't survive there. How will the police start looking for her? She'll be dead already," a familiar voice said. Noah came closer and noticed his uncle, covering his mouth in surprise. He quickly turned on the voice recorder on his phone and listened further. "Molly should be dead by the beginning of next month. You will do everything I say, and then I will deal with her myself." James finished and hung up. Noah disconnected, saved the recording, and immediately hurried to the car. James turned around and noticed the familiar blonde head that was running so hurriedly to the exit. Strange and even scary thoughts were turning in his head. He urgently needed to report this to Nancy, and together they would decide what to do about it. Arriving at the commission, he rang the doorbell, and the girl, surprised, let him in. "Is Nancy at your place?" asked an excited Smith, looking around at the acquaintance he had had such a good time with. The girl nodded and led the boy into the kitchen. His twin sister sat casually drinking tea, not even realizing what news her brother had rushed in with. "I have very bad news," Noah said, and sat down across from his sister. He cast meaningful glances at Aniston, as if asking if she could be trusted. It was as if she had read his mind and was about to leave. As Nancy called out to her, "She could be trusted. She won't give Noah a crap," a still unhealthy Nancy said, and stared at her brother. But what was the matter? In a hurry, the boy told all he'd heard and what he'd been doing at his father's company. The girls looked at Noah with open mouths and wide open eyes. Kelly, though she had no idea what was going on, was shocked at the cruelty of a man she didn't know. "We need to go to Marlowe," Noah assured her, not taking his eyes off his sister's friend. "What's been cooking dinner already?" After that strange story, "Is this your friend who works for the police?" Nancy asked, wiping her palms on the sides of her jeans. The blonde nodded and fell back into his thoughts. They had found out things they shouldn't have known, but they couldn't let their uncle get away with threatening their grandmother's life. Noah frantically dialed the number of Jacob, whom he had met at one of the races years ago. The first time he'd gone out, they'd started chatting, and after a while Jacob had become a cop, and he'd had no time at all for riding around town and racing illegally. But they'd meet occasionally, drink whiskey, and talk about life and the past. "Jacob, hey, I have an urgent non-phone call," Noah said, and then said goodbye and hung up. And Nancy frowned. She was afraid he'd said no, but Noah assured her they could talk to him tomorrow. "And if you tell your father," Kelly reprimanded, cutting the potatoes into large chunks. She turned to the boys and shrieked sharply. Blood started coming from her finger, and the knife fell on her foot, catching her ankle. Noah jumped up from his seat and instantly flew over to the girl, grabbing her arm. "Are you okay?" The guy examined the toe. "We need to treat it right away. The cut is deep." Kelly laughed and grabbed a tissue and applied it to the wound. "I'm a failed medic, aren't I?" "It's okay. I'm working." The guy's eyes traveled down to the girl's legs and ankle too. Nancy squinted at the moose and began to examine him with interest. He brought his eyebrows down to the bridge of his nose and looked at his sister judgmentally. "So what about the father?" Kelly asked again, while she worked on her toe. Nancy was applying ointment to her foot at the time. "He doesn't like his mother, and neither does James. I don't know what might come of it, but that's the last person I'd tell," Noah said, still excited. "So we should get home. You change the bandages in a while, dear," Nancy concluded, and started to get up from the table. "I'll get my purse and we can go." Noah and Kelly were left alone, looking at each other in confusion. Determined to speak, they said at one point, "How about it?" A resounding laugh echoed throughout the kitchen. Kelly lowered her head in embarrassment and allowed the guy to continue with the first one. "I was going to say maybe we could go to that track again tonight. I'd offer to take you driving, give it a try, but you're a little out of shape," Noah stated, not taking his eyes off her bright blue ones. "I'd only be happy to come pick me up at 9. Noah nodded and smiled so radiantly that Kelly herself stretched out in a smile so wide you could see all 32 teeth. Nancy entered the room and kissed her friend on the cheek, pulling her brother up by his sweater to go home. Liam, meanwhile, lay on his bed, occasionally glancing at his phone. He was waiting for some kind of message, just to be needed. He suffered from loneliness, and his promiscuous sexual encounters for 7 years had not brought Noah any pleasure. His dream was the love of his parents and a family, which he felt he never had. A quiet knock sounded at the door, and his father entered the room, still the same stern, cold man, and Liam was already tuning in for another lecture on his behavior. "How are you, son?" A bunch of questions popped into Liam's head. James had never called him son. From the moment he turned 10, unpleasant memories popped into his head, and he clenched his jaws so they could set things off perfectly. His voice was detached, and his father noticed it. Sitting down on the edge of the bed, he was silent for a long time, as if tuning into a conversation that should have happened long ago. He, too, wanted to express his pain about his son, but decided it wouldn't be today. "I have one important favor to ask of you." Smith Sr. Liam's eyes were full of hope for a father's love, but in an instant they faded, and he stared at the man again as if he were a complete stranger to him. "I know you won't be with Noel. I'm going to ask you to do something, and in return you'll get a share in the company you'll run after I die." Liam swallowed and raised his eyebrows in surprise. "I'm listening, Father." Nancy, upon arriving home, flopped into bed and shivered almost as soon as she lowered her face onto the pillow. Noah shook his head unhappily and, leaving his sister's bag on the chair next to the bed, left her room. The living room was where their mother usually spent her time. There was a sound, the clinking of dishes, and Noah, not thinking long, rushed there. Mason was leaning over Cindy, who was trying to pick up the shards from the glass, and whispered something in her ear. "Mom, are you okay?" Noah asked, coming closer. His mom was sitting on the floor in a half-bent state. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking with splinters in them. "I'll help you." Noah began to pick up the glass, and a maid came into the room that also quickly started cleaning up. Mason helped his wife up onto the couch, and his son and father sat on either side of the woman. "Mom, you've been very pale for some time now. Are you sure you're all right?" the boy asked, taking his mother's hand in his own. Her skin was cold, and the veins on the back of her palm deflated. "Cindy, tell me." Mason's voice, next to his wife's, seemed almost velvety. He spoke to her as gently as he could afford. "Let's go to the hospital tomorrow. I don't like your condition." "I'm fine. I'm not eating well." That's why I'm pale. I'm fine. Her voice was faintly audible, and the men clearly didn't believe it, but left her with the questioning, "Where's the starfish?" The father of the family smirked and threw a glance at his son, waiting to see what he would say. "Your little star is resting, sleeping like a bear in hibernation," laughed Noah to distract his mom. He treasured her madly, loved and respected her. It pained him to see the state of the one who had raised and educated him. "Do they promise that if you get sick, you'll tell one of us?" Mason asked, looking into his wife's pale face. Tanya nodded eagerly and smiled, stroking her son's and her husband's hands. Noah, satisfied that his mother's condition had normalized, hurried to his room to get some rest. Kelly spent the entire evening deciding what to wear. She wanted to look good, for Noah was indeed attracted to her. She knew a lot of people liked her, but it wasn't so easy to get her attention. Choosing a black skirt, shorts, and a top of the same color, the girl began to put on chains and rings. They harmoniously complemented her bold image. Gathering her long dark hair into a high ponytail, she looked at the time, 9:30. All that was left was to wait. 8:50, the doorbell rang, and with a good in the mirror, she ran to open it. Noah stood before her in a leather jacket, dark jeans, and with a chain on which hung a beautiful dragon pendant. It was the same one she had seen Nancy wearing. "Hey, you look beautiful," Noah said, looking the girl over from top to toe. She smiled embarrassedly and was about to step out, throwing her jacket on. "Are you going to need it?" Kelly hesitated, realizing that it was summer outside and all the jackets were left at his mother's apartment. "I don't have one here." "Is it cool outside?" the girl asked, not understanding, looking at Noah. "We're not going by car," smirked the guy and began to take off his knee. "No, you're cold. I'm going to change my clothes now. I'm going to put on some sports clothes," Kelly exclaimed, and already turned around to rush to the closet, as she was stopped by a man's hand. "You'll wear mine. Your look will fit perfectly where we're going now," Noah concluded, and the Kenyan got into the paint, quickly closing the apartment and putting on the guy's leather jacket. Kelly hurried after Noah. A black Suzuki Iron Horse was waiting for them near the entrance. Noah looked at it with pride and admiration. "Wow, you drive one of these. I thought we were going to walk," Kelly said in surprise, stepping closer to the bike. "I know how to surprise," Noah said and winked at the girl. And she only dreamed with him even more. She seemed like a little girl who had never once flirted with grown boys before, even though she was already 26. Noah gently placed the helmet on the girl and helped her buckle it on. Later, he did the same to himself, and they rushed off on their adventure. Kelly, hooked into Noah's belt, looked out at the city flying by. She'd lived here for over 10 years, but this was the first time she'd seen it like this. Noah wasn't gaining much speed, but still the adrenaline flowed into her bloodstream, tingling through her body. "Aren't you scared?" shouted Noah so the girl behind him could hear him. "Noah, it's beautiful," shouted back, and she pressed herself even tighter against the guy. He smiled and rushed towards the exit. They arrived at the same highway where they had gone for a car ride yesterday. The place was lively, a bunch of motorcycles, half-naked girls, and stripped guys that tried to appear brutal in front of a bunch of women's hearts. "We're here for the race?" asked Nilsades, jumping off the motorcycle. Several pairs of eyes nearby were immediately drawn to them. The girl immediately felt uncomfortable and turned to Noah. "I rode my first motorcycle race today," the boy said, smiling. A strange feeling overtook Kelly. She was scared. The smile fell off her face and she lowered her eyes. The blonde guy noticed the change in his friend's mood and gently circled his arm around her waist, beckoning her over to him. She was taken aback, but didn't pull away. "Don't be afraid. I'll leave you with my acquaintances. The race doesn't last that long. I'll be back quickly," Noah said and looked her straight in the eye. He was warm and gentle, and she felt safe and secure around him. The girl nodded slowly and looked at everyone present. and noticed a heavy gaze on herself. The guy standing in the distance did not take his eyes off Noah and Kelly, who were almost in an embrace not far from the start. "Who's that?" the girl asked, nodding her head toward the stranger. The girl's dark-haired hand clenched sharply, and raising her head, she noticed Noah's eyes flashed with rage. "Are you okay? Maybe we should go." Off to the side stood Liam Verlaine, his cousin, and his companion with a look. He wanted to take this pretty girl away from him, just like he'd stolen the girl he no longer wanted. "That's my cousin Nancy and me." The son of the same James gave Noah away, trying to keep his temper in check. He was mostly quiet, didn't like arguments and emotional fights, but he did get into fights sometimes. When situations really got to him, Kelly squirmed involuntarily, and Noah pulled her closer to him. It was Chechen, but he wanted to show Liam that the girl came with him and would leave too. Liam disappeared from the sight of the two of them, and then the preparations for the race began. "This is Kelly. I'm leaving her with you." Jack did not let anyone near her or away from her. Noah whispered angrily, approaching his friend. Kelly said hello to her companion for the next 20 minutes and stood next to him. "He won't hurt you. Don't be afraid. We'll go for a ride after the race." He winked again. Kelly squirmed in embarrassment. "Be careful," the girl whispered, and the guy smiled. Walking away, he turned once more and gave her a warm look, letting her know he was there for her. Standing on the start line, Noah noticed with his side vision Liam, who was standing 3 bikes to the right, and grinning achidically, looking over at his brother. Noah knew that the man had been racing a motorcycle for years and that doing it would be difficult, but that was his main goal for tonight. Glancing at Kelly again, Noah assumed the ready position and waited for the girl to come out to announce the start. They flew at breakneck speed, left in the lead by only the two of them. 2 sons, 2 brothers, that warred with each other as much as they did. Noah's maneuverability was superior, but Liam's bike was superior. The finish line was close, and Noah went for an overtake. Making a big mistake, failing to control, Noah went off the track and into a ditch. Before doing so, it flipped twice. Screams echoed through the crowd, and Kelly gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "Is that Noah?" Kelly asked in a shaky voice to Jack, who was standing there in complete shock. "Say it." "Noah," shouted the race organizer and rushed to Port, who was not far away from him. Kelly's breath caught, and she stopped hearing the people around her. Her pulse raced at a breakneck speed, and her legs became absorbent cotton. She didn't know what to do, and only slowly Morgana hoping that it was just a dream. "Eating," the doctor shouted into the organizer's mouthpiece. Kelly snapped out of her trance and looked around. Jack was no longer beside her. Noah, who was clearly unconscious, was being carried from the track in her arms. "Is there a doctor here?" She pushed through the crowd and overcame her fear. Rushed to the guys who were carrying her friend. "I'm a doctor," Kelly shouted and grabbed the first aid kit from the guy who was carrying her, apparently to Noah. The same familiar Jack laid the blonde on the makeshift couch that the guys had built and stared intently into his friend's face. Kelly picked herself up and walked over to Noah, and her arm was covered in blood. Her clothes were torn, and her head was still in her helmet. "Take the helmet off," the girl muttered. Everyone around them crowded around, but apparently they didn't hear her. "Get that damn helmet off him." "I can't," she screamed. Tears were pooling in her eyes. Jack obeyed the girl and carefully removed the helmet from his friend. There was a small abrasion on his face, but his hair had shrunk to a scarlet color. Niz lifted his head and found a serious cut in the neck area. Grabbing the disinfectant, the agent began to treat the wounds, her body filled with adrenaline. She ripped the t-shirt on Noah's chest with all her might, thus causing the crowd to gasp in amazement. There was a branch sticking out somewhere in the rib area, and blood spurted from the wound beneath it, covering the guy's pale skin. "Call an ambulance," Kelly shouted. "You can't. Everyone here is illegally paddling us all," cried out the organizer standing in the front row of onlookers. but he could lose a lot of blood. No one answered, and the crowd began to thin out. There were no more than 30 people left. Kelly sighed heavily and threw off her leathers with a freak-out, then pulled off her top. The guys perked up dramatically. "Keep your lust to yourself." "Pro," growled Jack, apparently remembering Noah's words. Kelly put on Jenka again, which smelled so Noah Ablayazov. Her lips dried with excitement. She held out her top to Jack and spoke. "I took a branch of dust out of his wound, and you immediately, putting it on top and pressing. But not hard, I realized." The lad nodded, and everyone also watched what was happening. "There's alcohol, strong vodka, whiskey, tequila?" Kelly asked, and some guy handed her a bottle of Jack Daniels. She nodded gratefully and opened the bottle. In a minute, she had already treated her hands and the skin around the wound. In one motion, she pulled out a branch and poured whiskey over the wound. Jack instantly followed the girl's edict and pressed down with a cloth. Bloodshed generously threaded the needle. Kelly turned to the girls again. A girl in the crowd hesitated and ran to the car. Kelly hoped that some crazy person actually had these things with them. Noah stopped abruptly, and Kelly flew to his face, looking around him. "Do you see me?" Abruptly she asked. He nodded slowly and gravely. Kelly turned on the flashlight and started checking the guy's eyes until she saw the girl's outstretched hand with the bobbins and black needle threads. Kelly looked at it questioningly, as if asking, "Where did you get that from?" "I'm a clothing designer. Always have it with me. And apparently for good reason," she said and smiled. The smile was more frightened than sincere. Noah tried to get up, but Kelly's hand stopped him. "Lie down better." The girl pulled the long sleeve of her jacket and held it out to the boy's face. "It will hurt when it bites." He looked at the girl through his eyelashes, not understanding, and then obeyed. And she found herself undressed again in only one bra. And Jack gave everyone around him a very unkind look. The guys gulped, but stopped whispering. Jack was still holding the wound fearfully and looked at Kelly, hoping she would get his friend cleaned up soon. "Jack, can you clean up?" Kelly said firmly, as if this was a normal situation, and it wasn't the first time she'd been on the racetrack for her friend, with a regular needle and thread. Seeing the wound near her nose, she closed her lips and blinked to keep from crying. In a second, she had already pierced living flesh with the needle, and Noah jerked, sinking her teeth into the tight leather of the jacket. "Sha, it's going to be okay," whispered Kelly, continuing to sew with trembling hands. Everyone watched this as if it were a show, afraid that at one point the girl would give up. "I'm finishing up." "Noah, it's okay." The guy was pale and was fainting, probably from blood loss. Kelly finished sewing and moved closer to the guy's face. "We still have to go to the hospital. Who can take us?" Kelly said hopefully, looking out at the crowd. The girl who had helped with the thread and needle volunteered again. Jack carried Noah to the car, and Kelly, apparently recovering from the shock, began to shake, looking at her bloody hands. "You saved him," said Jack, approaching the girl. "And not yet," Kelly said through her tears, and got into the front seat of the new BMW. They drove as fast as they could, but I couldn't get away from what had happened, and the kind stranger tried to support her. When they arrived at the hospital, they called for the paramedics. "Thank you," Kelly said, turning to the stranger. "What's your name?" "Yuliana." "Thank you." Not everyone would dare to do such a thing, giving her a smile. Yuliana wished her a speedy recovery and went home. She was scared too, but not as much as the one who protected the man sitting with her knees on the bare asphalt. Kelly quickly dialed her friend's number. Red stains formed on the phone, and tears came to her throat again. "Nancy, Hospital 5. Your brother's been in an accident," the girl said, and without waiting for an answer, dropped the call. She wouldn't take questions from the twin sister of someone who was now unconscious, with multiple injuries. Kelly sat alone in the bright hallway, her eyes unsupported, swollen with tears, and blood already caked on her hands. Excitement and fear filled every cell of the girl's body, and she couldn't contain the shivering that Noah hadn't relented from the moment they got here. "Kelly!" shouted Nancy, and her parents followed. "Explain." The blonde, seeing her friend's hands, burst into tears and was ready to faint. But her father managed to catch her from behind. "Where is he? What's wrong with him?" Nancy's cry echoed throughout the hospital, and a nurse looked out of the office. Dear Mother put her arm around her shoulders and sat down beside her. "We're nervous, and I guess you are too. Tell me, please," Mason said quietly, sitting down next to Kelly. "We went to the race. He was in the front with his cousin." Kelly burst out nervously. Surprise was reflected on the gray-haired man's face. "He went into a ditch," NASA continued to tell us. "He got a cut on his neck and a bunch of abrasions. A branch pierced his ribs." And then Kelly started crying. She started to cover her face with her hands, thus smearing the naked liquid around her eyes. She couldn't believe that the first guy she liked so much could die now. Nancy cried a little longer. Cindy could barely contain herself from passing out. The doctor came out of the room and looked around at those present. "Who stitched up the wound?" asked a middle-aged man dressed in a white coat. When he noticed Kelly, he immediately realized it was her and turned to her. The girl tensed nervously with the man in charge. She was afraid to hear that her action could have cost Noah his life. "If it wasn't for you, he probably wouldn't have gotten here. You did the right thing and saved that guy's life," the doctor concluded. The girl threw her head back and exhaled in relief. Mason immediately took the doctor aside to talk. "Have you been embroidering, Noah?" Nancy asked quietly, trying to regain her composure after her tantrum. Kelly nodded slowly, not even turning to her friend. "You saved his life." The blonde jumped on her friend and started kissing her, not noticing the dark scarlet streaks on her face. "You saved him," Cindy said, looking at Kelly gratefully. She nodded and clung to her friend. Mason returned and whispered something to Cindy. She took Nancy's hand, and they went into Noah's room. "Now tell me, please, which brother did you mean when you said they were in the front together?" excitedly asked Mason. Looked on. The next day, Noah was feeling better, but he was still in a hospital bed. In the hallway sat his family as well as Kelly, who was waiting for him to wake up. Molly entered the hospital with slow steps. I looked anxiously at my son and daughter-in-law. "How is he?" she asked quietly, approaching Cindy. She said something inaudible. And the old woman went over to Mason. Nancy was asleep on her friend's shoulder. Apparently, the stress had taken all the strength she could muster. "Mason," the woman said, and stroked her son's head. "Call me that." "Pro," growled Smith, and roughly threw back his mother's hand. She shook her head unhappily, but still looked at him with love and pity. "One person can come in for 5 minutes, the doctor said as he left the room. "But the patient wants to see a certain Kelly." Everyone turned to the dark-haired girl who sat still covered in blood. Nancy wiped her friend's face with wet wipes in the night. Oh no, take note. There was still blood on her hands. She didn't get up from her seat exactly until she got to the hospital. It was like she was afraid that when she stepped away, the irreparable would happen. "Kelly doesn't want to see you," Nancy said quietly in a sleepy voice. Kelly immediately perked up, but was still trembling as she entered the room. Walking over to the hospital bed, she slowly lowered herself to the edge and looked into the guy's eyes. "Alive." "Relieved," the girl said, and a tear rolled down her tear-swollen cheeks. "Thank you," the boy replied, and took her hand. "I'm sorry for putting you through this. You're alive, and that's all that matters." Kelly waved him away and smiled, strained but sincere. 3 weeks later, the accident was still being investigated by Mason, who strongly suspected his nephew Liam. Noah had already been discharged and was perfectly healthy, although he was not allowed to drive yet, which made him very angry. After the accident, Nancy met with Jacob, the very same policeman, and told him what her uncle was up to against her grandmother. They devised their plan so that they could save her grandmother and catch him. James, red-handed since there was no solid evidence to hold him. Kelly persevered in caring for her friend in the hospital, and they became noticeably closer to Noah during this time. "Do you like him?" Nancy asked with a squint, pouring tea into a mug. Kelly sat across from her and angrily colored. "I've liked him exactly from the moment I saw him. What are we even talking about?" The friends laughed and continued chatting. Nancy was still worried about the situation with her grandmother and occasionally called Jacob, who had introduced the task force to Molly's house. She needed to make sure her grandmother was going to be okay. "Would you do it again?" James said in a gruff tone, glaring at his son. "What if they realize?" Liam asked fearfully, shifting from foot to foot. "You're going to solve the dam breaks now. Otherwise, you'll never see the company again," shouted James, and Charles entered the office. "You have no right to blackmail him." "Father." The older son's tone embarrassed James, and he shifted his stern gaze to him. "You dare to cross me. You will not blackmail my brother. Remember that," Charles said firmly, and almost walked out of the study, hoping that his father would stop doing that to his younger son. But then Liam's voice rang out. "I'll do it, Father." And Charles realized that he was only doing it to spite him. He got behind the wheel. A few days later, Noah went to ICE, where Nancy and Jacob were already gathered. It was some kind of secret place where they were discussing the grandmother's case. He parked in his usual spot and headed for the driveway. The door was opened by a blue-eyed beauty that was already looking at Noah with a loving gaze. He winked at her and later meekly left her cheek and made his way inside the apartment. The four of the guys discussed Uncle James first and later started chatting about various topics. Kelly and Noah noticed some sort of invisible connection between Nancy and Jacob, but were only observing for now, not drawing conclusions. The girls began to prepare dinner. Noah watched Kelly, and Jacob glanced glumly out the window. After a moment, he pulled out his phone and started filming something until Nancy noticed him. Guessed the girl stepped closer to the brunette. "Are you okay? Something about work? If you're gone, after Molly dies, will everything officially go to James?" Jacob asked, not taking his eyes off the fire. Nancy and Noah looked at each other in surprise. Kelly looked shocked. "Well, probably," Nancy replied warily. "Why do you ask? We can only put your damn brother in jail and disinherit James if your father isn't in on it with him," Jacob concluded, reviewing some kind of video on his phone. "And they're against each other. They can't be on the same side." Nancy gave it away, supposedly to stand up for her father. She couldn't stand his inhibitions, but she loved him nonetheless. Jacob disapproved, glanced at Kelly, and Noah tensed. But the tension went away quickly, and Jacob hurriedly went outside to call someone. 20 minutes later, he returned and hurried the guys out, asking Kelly to stay home. "Cindy, this is not normal. You lost 10 pounds in the last week," Mason exclaimed, pacing from side to side. "Are you sick?" "I'm fine." "What are you talking about?" Smiling tiredly, the woman said, and lay down on the couch. She rarely had dinner with her family lately and spent more and more time in bed. The phone rang and Mason picked up the receiver, answering in an irritated voice. Smith listened. The man's hand dropped, and the phone collapsed to the floor. Eyes on Could and her legs gave out, causing Cindy to jump up from her seat and walk over to her husband. Though she was dizzy herself, "Indivisible mine," the man issued, folding the lump that had formed in his throat. "Cindy, our babies." The blonde brought her eyebrows together at the bridge of her nose and turned her spouse's face toward her with a cold palm. "Mason, what Noah?" Cindy asked in a shaky voice, realizing that the look on her husband's face didn't bode well. "Our children are dead," Mason said questioningly, as if asking his wife if it was true. "Mason," Cindy whispered and staggered, and then fell into her husband's arms as well. Websites and channels were filled with news of Smith's death. There was a terrible accident outside of town today that killed the heirs to Smith Mason, known as the perfect twins Nancy and Noah Smith, born in 1990. At this point, it is known that after the brakes failed, the car flew into a ditch and caught fire. The bodies have been taken away for identification and other details are being established. Cindy was immediately admitted to the intensive care unit after this news and was found to have the last stage of leukemia. Mason identified with the children, became depressed, and Kelly stopped leaving the house. Even weeks after the funeral, Jacob visited occasionally to support her, but it did not help her at all. The pain and mourning affected absolutely everyone except James Smith's family. It was as if he was rejoicing in his victory, that he'd finally gotten rid of his longtime rival. Gasps, "Dad, I dream about them," Liam said quietly as he approached his father. He had been awake for the last 3 o'clock, and he looked bad. Black circles under his eyes, dried lips and dark hollows above his puckered ones. "Don't whine like a boy. You did the right thing. You wanted a place in the company, and you got it," James said sternly and asked his son to leave his office. "You did the right thing." The young man's hands trembled, and his eyes showed fear. He was haunted by echoes of the time he had ruthlessly cut the brake cable in his cousin's car, after which he had burned almost alive in the same car. "If your uncle finds out, die." Liam, covering his face with his hands. He was really scared. "I thought we were only trying to maim them, like in a race." "You faltered then," and he ran out behind his girlfriend. "Don't beat yourself up," James concluded and patted his son on the shoulder. Liam walked out of his father's office on woozy legs and still didn't realize that he had killed 2 people with his own hands. He slowly made his way to his brother's room and knocked quietly. "Come in." His tone was still cold and detached. Liam entered and quietly sat down on the bed. Charles looked at his brother in surprise and crossed his fingers on his stomach as he lay in bed. "I've done something stupid," Liam said, and looked into his brother's eyes, hoping for his support. "Tell me, am I terrible? You've only become your father's puppet. I don't blame you for craving attention from that freak," Charles said firmly and rose to embrace his brother. They both felt each other's warmth, as if after a long separation. "I have always loved you and will always love you, brother. Stop being what you are now. Your real side is much better." There was a knock on the front door. "Superintendent Marlowe. Smith Liam lives here." Kelly sat in her room and occasionally came out to get a drink of water. She did. Over the past week, her skin had grown pale, lost its healthy luster, and her eyes had faded and seemed to be gone forever. It was the first time she'd ever loved so much. Then she'd almost lost it at the race, and now it was truly dead. Losing her best friend was just as painful as losing her lover. At first she hadn't believed it, saying it couldn't be, that he wasn't the one who was supposed to die. Her body filled with unbearable pain. Her heart clenched and her breathing was interrupted so badly that she wanted to die herself. No one held her back at the funeral, and she literally flooded Noah and Nancy's coffin with tears. There was a barely audible knock on the door, and for some reason Kelly remembered Noah knocking quietly. She jumped up and almost fell over. She was getting very dizzy from malnutrition. "Jacob was lost," Kelly said, looking at her friend through the veil of tears in her eyes. "I was so excited to see Noah here." The boy stepped inside and pulled his friend against him. She sobbed, bumping Jacob's nose into his chest, soaking his white shirt with her tears. "We found the person responsible for the accident. Liam will go to jail soon," Jacob issued, and at some point, something clicked in the girl's mind. She wished the guilty would pay and pay all over the world. "It's their brother, isn't it? I'm sure he set that up at that race too," Kelly said, wiping the tears from her boot-red cheeks. She looked lifeless, as if her soul had gone out of her and only a shell remained. Jacob nodded and took a seat at the table. He was flustered, but he was also trying to keep his cool. He's a cop, and it's inherent in him to deceive those he'd rather not deceive. Cindy Sunshine didn't want to go to the hospital for some reason, Mason asked, looking at his wife with empty blue eyes. He sat for days at the grave of his own children, and now he sits by the hospital bed of his already dying wife. "I've lost everything." My angels are gone. Repeated nonstop every day. Cindy stared at the white ceiling. The doctors said that in addition to leukemia, she had a very delicate psyche, and after the death of her children, it was unlikely that she would be able to become what she was. Unless, of course, she lives longer than a month. Don't leave me, I'm all alone. Beloved, don't leave Snow White. Mason smiled strangely and took his wife's cold, pale hand. He called her Snow White. In their not-too-distant youth, she had indeed had fair, radiant skin that beckoned to be touched. I love you. I've lost everything. My angels are gone. Cindy whispered again and fell into a deep sleep. Mason waved away a tear and rubbed his face with his hands, trying to bring himself to his senses. He walked out of the room, pulling his cell phone out of his pocket. James is doing his thing. I'll help with the mother, and you give me my 20%. I have nothing more to lose, Smith stated and dropped the call. Molly sat in her living room and slowly sipped her tea, occasionally turning around at the door. She had lost her husband and 2 grandchildren, and it had taken its toll on her. She cried a lot after the funeral of the twins. It's hard to lose those one is supposed to protect. She had to leave this world before the 2 blonde-haired angels that had loved Grandma so much. Footsteps sounded in the house, and the old woman turned around. James. Mason raised his eyebrows in surprise, Molly said, delighted by the children's unexpected visit. Have you decided to visit me? Almost, Monty, James said, and grinned. He'd somehow kept his brother in the dark about the fact that his son had been taken to the police this morning on suspicion of attempted murder. In one motion, James held a handkerchief soaked in sleeping pills to his mother's face, and Mason turned away grudgingly, as if he didn't want to see his mother relieved. In his brother's hands, Father would never forgive us, he said, glaring at James. Good thing he can't see it, smirked Smith Jr., and beckoned to the guy standing outside the door. He grabbed the old woman's hands carelessly and dragged her to the car. She lives on the outskirts of town, not far from the woods. Let's just say she's always out walking in the evenings. And oh my God, James feigned surprise. She just got lost and was torn apart by wolves. You're a freak, Mason said. You should be glad I'm social. Otherwise I'd feel sorry for my mother. They drove in a black-tinted car with no license plates, while their mother lay in the trunk without any signs of life, stopped near a forest that stretched for many more kilometers. The subordinate James threw the old lady right out onto the ground. She moaned, but was still unconscious at the same time. Next, we go into the house ourselves and collect any evidence we can. Wipe the floor. No one can know we were at our mother's house, James said menacingly and grabbed his mother's hand. Mason followed suit and grabbed the other one. The boy nodded and got into the car, started the engine and squealed away. 2 brothers were dragging their own mother into the woods to her death. At one point she came to her senses and turned around to see the faces of her captors. Was it because of the inheritance? Almost crying, Molly spoke, raising her head at James. You even made your brother do this to me. There was a sharp pop, and the old woman passed out again. James rubbed the palm of his hand that had slapped his mother, and they continued into the depths of the woods, dumping her near a tree. Mason looked at his mother with regret, and then his head as if he wanted to convince himself that this was the way it should be. They began to move away from the place where they had left their mother. She was crying and moaning from the pain that stiffened her body, and not far away came the howling of wild animals. And a chill went down Molly's body, and she froze. And then she saw 2 people. They came down from heaven like angels. The guy knelt down in front of her and stroked her swollen wrinkles. The detectives. Hush, he whispered, and Molly finally lost consciousness. Quiet footsteps behind him. James heard and froze in place. Mason, do you hear the wolves? He asked his older brother, moving closer to him. He was a coward, and it showed. Hands up. You're under arrest for kidnapping and grievous bodily harm. Friends. There was a call. Jacob's voice was behind Mason's back. Marlowe grinned at how coolly he had planned the Smith brothers' arrest. He had only pointed the gun at Smith Sr. and James, noticing this, had rushed to escape. "Not so fast," Uncle whispered in a woman's caustic voice. James stumbled and fell. Turning around, he couldn't believe his eyes. Standing behind him was Nancy, a living, healthy Nancy holding a gun. "You thought you'd get rid of us with your pathetic son, and then get Granny out of the way." Nancy. Mason moved toward his daughter, but she pointed the gun at him. Noah appeared from behind, holding the barely standing grandmother. She was crying and thanking all the gods for her rescue. "Son," Smith Sr. spoke again. Tears sprang from his eyes. He dropped his knees to the ground and couldn't believe what was happening. "Nancy and I believed until the last moment that you were innocent." "Daddy," Noah said in a hoarse, trembling voice, "you're the most despicable thing that could have happened to us. After our uncle, of course. I'll make you suffer the way you made Grandma suffer," Nancy issued, clutching the gun in her hand more confidently. Jacob shook his head disapprovingly, and she angrily but still lowered the weapon. "You have nowhere to run. You are under arrest," Jacob stated and handcuffed both defendants. Jacob's game had started back in the day when he had filmed Liam cutting the brake cable on Noah's car from his apartment window, and he had called his coworkers and asked them to come in the driveway. Once Nancy and Noah came out, he had them change into their coworkers' clothes and, conversely, put them in the work car. He instructed his subordinates to fake an accident and plant a body from the last cottage fire that more or less resembled Nancy and Noah. It was a complicated operation, but Jacob executed it perfectly. He wanted to catch Smith Sr. He knew he had a criminal record, but he couldn't prove it yet. And to do that, he needed to put a void in his soul. That's what he did when he forced him to bury his own children. Nancy and Noah headed to the hospital to see their mother, but unfortunately they didn't make it in time. She had died 10 minutes before they arrived, and the press outside the clinic had time to snap pictures of the perfect twins, which only fueled the news feeds and channels in town. The two twins roared into each other's shoulder as they learned of their mother's death. They couldn't forgive themselves for her spending those hard days without them, thinking that her children had left her alone. Nancy bit her fists until they bled, trying to calm herself down, but all in vain. Her father, uncle, and cousin were behind bars. Her grandmother was in serious condition, and her mother was already dead. She could not bear all the pain that had come over her on this truly difficult day. They cried over their mother's body for a long time until she was taken to the morgue. There was no end to the suffering, and to feel a little bit of joy. The twins went to Casey's house so she could hug them again and believe they were alive. The door swung open, and Noah looked fearfully at the girl he had come to love so much. Hollows instead of eyes, a lost look of thinness, a body careless of hair and heavy breathing. "Noah," she said quietly. "Nancy, I need to start eating, or my hallucinations will get even earlier." Her legs jerked up, and Noah managed to catch her as she fell unconscious right in his arms. Her last words sounded scary. "I want to go after you so badly, Noah." They laid their friend on the bed. The room was in chaos, piles of sedative wrappers, water bottles, things. Everything was scattered, but not a single clue as to what she had eaten. Nancy, finding some ammonia in her friend's first aid kit, put Vyatka up to Kelly's nose, and somewhat awake, Sonny whispered softly to Nancy, trying to hold back tears. Noah sat motionless next to the girl, wrapping his arm around her palm with his hand. Nancy sighed heavily to Kelly, and then shifted her gaze to Noah. "Am I in heaven?" "We're alive. We'll explain everything to you. Just don't be nervous," the guy said in a hoarse voice. He was still in shock at what was happening, and the state of his lover drove him even more. 10 minutes later, and bald eyes were burning with fire, as she kissed Noah's face relentlessly. Sitting on his lap, she couldn't stop savoring his touch, and the scent she dreaded never to hear his hair again, whether to tickle her stroking neck as he hugged her tightly. In the meantime, Nancy would call Jacob and find out how things were going with her father and the rest of her relatives. "I missed you so much. I was so scared. I was so scared," whispered Kelly somewhere in the dimples of her collarbone as she snuggled against Noah. "You're the only thing I have besides my mom. I wanted you to be aware so you wouldn't have to go through what you've already been through." But Jacob said it was for the best, Noah said guiltily and stroked the girl's tangled hair. "Come on, you need a shower, and I'll order you something to eat. You don't look well, love." Something inside Kelly came to life. She flushed with color when the guy called her favorite. She jumped up cheerfully, but immediately grabbed her head. The dizziness was getting worse. "You do realize that if you keep quiet, you'll get a lot more than planned," Jacob said in a stern tone, alone with Mason Smith in the interrogation room. "I had nothing to do with anything they are hanging on me now," the man said confidently and raised his chin proudly. "Didn't you take your mother into the woods with your brother?" Jacob smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You made me bury my children who turned out to be alive only to put me behind bars. I bet you want to finish your father's job, don't you?" Mason gritted his teeth and smiled cheekily and imperiously. He was right. Jacob has long pursued the goal of getting rid of the overbearing Smith family, just as his late father, Police Captain Marlo Sam, wanted him to. Because of Nancy and Noah's father, Jacob's father died, and he felt obligated to punish him for it. "You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say can be used against you," Marlo said and smiled evasively again. A month later, she lowered her head quietly onto her brother's shoulder and waited for the verdict. Her palms were sweating, and she nervously clutched the hem of her skirt for what only looked like morning. Across from her sat Charles, shaking his tonic shoes with a disgruntled look. He tried to keep his mask of being a cold, stern, and emotionless guy. And if he didn't care at all about his father's fate, he was clearly nervous about Liam's sentence. "How'd it go?" Jumping up from his seat, Nancy asked as Jacob approached them. "The three of them will all sit far and wide for a long time," Jacob concluded and turned to Dimitri. "I hope you're smarter than your relatives. If you have plans to make your children put me in jail too, don't even think about it," nervously Charles said again and hurried out of the corridor. After her mother's death, everything that was her real estate went to Nancy, and the chattels to Noah. Cindy died with an agonizing pain in her heart, never knowing that her children were actually alive. It still tears the twins' hearts apart, and they still grieve, but try to hold on for the sake of the future. Everything the Smith brothers owned was confiscated by their court. They were extremely lucky that the company was still owned by their grandmother, and the family didn't lose it. Noah and Nancy made a pact with Charles that the entire company would go to him, even if Grandma decided to divide it all between the grandchildren. The twins finally decided that they didn't need the business and wanted to pursue creative endeavors and anything else their souls desired. The house remains in their possession, as it is Cindy's property. "I don't know how to feel. We have won justice, but how will I be without my father and mother lost?" asked Nancy, and looked at Kostya, while Noah called Nancy too. "You have Noah Kelly." He glanced nervously at who. That formed in his throat, "And you have me." Nancy raised her eyebrows in surprise and smiled warmly, placing her palms on Jacob's shoulders. She moved closer to him. "Does that mean you're asking me out?" With a sneer, she asked. "I thought you were already mine." Smiling, Jacob joked and kissed the girl on the forehead. "You are brave, beautiful, confident. I want to be with you, despite your family's misdeeds in the past." Yes, he had told the twins about his father's death, and he in no way blamed Nancy or Noah for it. He knew it was all their dishonorable father's fault. "Let's take Kelly and go to Grandma's with the four of us. She's feeling better, and I don't think she'd mind the company," Noah said, rising from his chair. Jacob and Nancy nodded. After waiting for Fader to do his business, they picked up Kelly and headed for that very out-of-the-way spot near the woods. The twins' minds were spinning with questions they wanted to ask their grandmother, but were worried about her health. "Hi, Grandma," said Nancy, hugging the old lady. She led everyone to the table, where freshly baked pies and waddles were already on the table. "This is Kelly, my best friend, and Noah's girlfriend," said Nancy, smiling broadly. She was insanely happy about this bond between brother and girlfriend, and these two people closest to her were happier together than ever. "Future wife," and actually corrected Noah. Everyone laughed amicably, and Kelly smacked his elbow in his side in embarrassment. "It's Jacob. You probably remember him, don't you? He's a police officer." Nancy steeled herself and continued, "And part-time boyfriend of mine." Grandma smiled genuinely and took a seat at the table as she put the kettle on the stove. "And you guys are so happy." She stroked Nancy and Kelly's hands. "I remember when Mason and James first brought Cindy and Benjamin to meet them." The young couple stared at Grandma, and Nancy and Noah wondered where Charles and Liam's mother had gone since they were little. "Grandma, tell us about them when they were young. We've already lost Mom." Nancy folded nervously, suppressing the tears that came to her throat. "And Benjamin, we didn't know at all. But listen," Molly grinned and began her story. "James was the first to show me his daughter-in-law. He was more malleable, always trying to please his father when he was young, wanting his praise and not to give it to Mason. He'd been prejudiced against me since I was a teenager. He thought I was overprotective of my adult son, even though he was barely 13 at the time. I loved them equally, but they both fought for their father's love, not mine." Kelly heard the whistle of the kettle, and without interrupting her grandmother, stood up and began pouring tea into mugs. Benjamin he brought in his 22 years, and she was very beautiful, tall, with long black hair and innocent green eyes. Charles was starting to look a lot like her now, just as cold, but at the same time attractive and admirable as his mother. She and I hit it off almost immediately, but for some reason unknown to me, James kept her away from me. She treated me lovingly when they visited occasionally. I still remember her sweet vanilla scent. I remember it too. The bassist blared, and the tone, and everyone at the table turned their heads toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway was Charles. His eyes were filled with tears, but he held his head proudly. Grandma cried out and rushed towards Charles. The same hugged the grandmother so tightly that it seemed her Jacob was about to burst. "I missed you," Charles said quietly, so that only Grandma could hear. "And Mom too." She patted him on the shoulder and invited him to the table. No one objected. "Benjamin was a real angel to James, and he probably blames me for her death," Grandmother said, lowering her head guiltily. "Why?" Kelly asked with interest. She cast an understanding glance at Charles, who was trying to keep himself from crying. "When she got pregnant with Liam, the doctors said that if she gave birth, she might die. Both Benjamin and I were the only ones who believed in a miracle that never happened. James couldn't forgive me for siding with his wife and letting her die in childbirth." A tear rolled down his cheek, and Charles carefully waved it away from his grandmother's face. He really did love her, but apparently he hadn't known how to show it before. Was that why Liam had become the object of his uncle's hatred? Nancy asked. Charles wrinkled his nose. "Yes," said the oldest of the Smith brothers firmly. That was why he considered grandmother and Liam to be the fault of no one else. Nancy's chest stabbed treacherously. She didn't know they had such a sad family history because her father and mother had always forbidden discussing the James family. "Do you know why Mom disliked Father Charles and Liam so much?" Noah asked, drinking his second cup of tea, which Kelly was kindly handing out. She felt as if she were sitting with the people closest to her, and she loved him. Charles said, answering for his grandmother. She raised her eyebrows in surprise. "How do you know?" Molly asked. She patted her grandson on the shoulder. "James told you." "I figured it out." Nancy and Noel looked at each other, but did not interfere and waited for the story to continue. Cindy and James were in the same year at university. She'd been chasing him for a long time, and he'd sort of reciprocated. Mason at the time had already graduated and was busy with business. James might have married her if he hadn't met Benjamin, who drove him crazy, in his third year. Cindy suffered for a long time, trying to get James' attention, and soon she learned that he had an older brother. At first, she wanted her lover to be jealous of Mason, and then Mason fell head over heels in love with Cindy. Grandma took a drink of tea and looked around at everyone present. They listened with interest to the story of their parents when they were young. James paid no attention to her, and when Mason brought her in as a daughter-in-law, I could tell by the looks in their eyes what Cindy wanted. I decided it wasn't worth hiding it from Mason and told him everything. He didn't believe it and said I just didn't want his happiness. From that time on, Mason stopped calling me mother and stopped thinking of me as a mother at all. The old woman's eyes brimmed with tears, and she couldn't stand it any longer and started crying. I just wanted my children to be happy. That's what they did to me. The grandchildren and Jacob leaned over their grandmother and cradled her as best they could. She cried and hugged her grandchildren, hoping that they would stay with her for the rest of her life, that they would not abandon her like her sons had done. We are not our fathers. We love you and appreciate you, Noah said, and Charles and Nancy confirmed, nodding. And in fact, we're going to take you to live at our house. There's plenty of room, and we won't be so lonely. You can also move in with me, Grandmother, Charles said, and looked at the old woman with understanding. I'm alone, and you. He stopped talking abruptly. You loved my mother so much. You are the only reminder of her. Nancy could not contain herself and tears rolled down her cheeks. She walked over to her cousin and hugged him. I'm sorry we weren't close, she said in a whisper. It's not your fault, Stargirl, Charles said. And Nancy was taken aback. Only her mother called her that. Charles understood the look in her eyes and went on. When you were little, I was often left to play with you, while my mother was still alive when she was pregnant with Lung, so you don't quite remember her. Noah was quiet, so he didn't require much attention. But here you were, Charles, grinning and looking at Nancy. With such warmth and love. You were always crying and missing your mommy. I found a star in my toys that Michaela had in different colors and gave it to you. You looked at it for a long time, and then you smiled and stopped crying. Charles was still looking at his little sister. I always wanted to be near you, but our parents were unbearable. You're the one who gave me that star I played with until I was 15. Nancy smiled and looked at Charles admiringly. You're incredible. It was such a pleasant evening, filled with bitter truths and happy memories from the past. Charles felt cozy in this atmosphere and didn't seem so cold anymore. Grandmother said that Benjamin also lowered her barrier only when she trusted and was ready to open up, and that rarely happened. Cindy, on the other hand, always held her head high and never let anyone doubt her. After a while, Charles and Grandma moved into Nancy and Noah's mansion, creating their own perfect family. Noah had also made Sophia a proposal, and they waited for the moment when they could finally consummate their marriage. I don't like talking, shouted Charles from the bathroom as he cleaned himself up before breakfast. I want plain scrambled eggs. My dear, are you going to order at the restaurant? Senya snapped cheerfully, standing at the stove in the Smith mansion. She was teasing Charles so easily and casually that they seemed to be more than acquaintances, already long-established friends. I baked the waddles, Grandma said, laying out her work of art sporting a sliced plate. You like them, don't you? We do. The twins both gave out in one voice, walking into the kitchen, camo and bacon, shouted Kelly, so she would know how to cook. Charles answered me, coming out of the bathroom, and Noah said to me, walking up to the girl, he put his arm around her waist and kissed her temple gently. Me too, came a familiar voice. Nancy turned around. Jacob stood in the doorway with a large bouquet of flowers. I didn't interrupt your family idyll. You're just in time, the blonde said, and kissed the guy on the lips, pulling him behind her neck. You, sputtered Charles and smiled. You do, because you're the only loner here. Laughed Noah. Well, except for Grandma. The room filled with laughter and joy. They thought there were no such thing as happy families and had been living their dreams, until they were all together under one roof at home. Nancy, that dreamed of being an artist or designer, who thought she would someday have to surrender into her father's hands and carry on his business, has become free. She is doing what she loves the one who loves her, and is with the people closest to her. Being perky and confident, she became softer around Jacob, for he was a man willing to do anything for her. Noah, who was quiet and calm, and dreamed of speed and adrenaline. He became what he wanted to be. He became a car guy and found his adrenaline in the one who gives it to him. Kelly glows around him, and he lets her be loved and feel safe. Charles, what tried so long and carefully to hide his feelings and emotions, has finally found a loving family where there is no tyrant father. There is a brother and sister who appreciate and love him. He sometimes longed for Liam, even cried, blames himself for not being able to protect him from their jerk father's nefarious plans, but there is nothing to fix. Liam had chosen his path, which had led him into the abyss. Molly was feeling better than ever. She was happy that her grandchildren were happy, but sad that her children had never been able to accept her desire to make them happy. "Are you sorry?" quietly asked Charles, while on a visit with his brother Liam and in the prison colony. "I regret not being like you, cold and emotional. Then I wouldn't have felt the pain that my father had caused me all those years ago," Liam said guiltily. His lip was split, and there was a huge bruise under his eye. "I miss you, brother." "I miss you too, Liam." Charles' eyes filled with tears. "I want you to live with us so badly, to feel the warmth that I feel now. I only became alive when I got rid of my father, and I can never get rid of him," Liam replied. "It's like he's gotten into my brain under my skin. I see his eyes everywhere. I want to hear his approval. I want to know he's proud of me." Liam was already shaking with nerves, but he tried to hold on. "Forget it. You'll be out in a few years, and I'll be there for you. You're my brother, and I won't leave you," Charles said, and gave his brother a warm look. He left the visiting room. That's how it is when you live your life without thinking about how good or bad things can be. Beyond the boundaries of your thoughts, some are released and get into trouble, and some are held hostage and left to rot alive. And there are those who choose comfort and joy, and they become happy by crossing borders. "Did I really live to see my great-grandchildren?" laughed Molly, looking at the two wonderful babies that lay in the crib, quite identical, Leo and Leon, two twins. "You gave birth to beautiful babies." And my dear Molly hugged Iniesta by the shoulders and kissed him on the cheek. "You are one of the reasons for my happiness." "Who's the little one?" Charles entered the room, leaned over her nephews. "Kelly, congratulations. It's a miracle." A tall, fair-skinned girl with long dark hair and green eyes entered the room behind Charles. Molly couldn't believe her eyes and slowly approached the girl. "Benjamin," tearfully spoke the old woman, stroking the young woman on the cheek. The girl did not send Liam, smiled. "I am Charles' girlfriend." Her eyes sparkled with happiness, and her smile stretched so wide that she threatened to tear her face. "Yes, Grandma. I'd like you to meet me. It's a phenomenon." He turned to the brunette. "And this is my favorite grandma, Molly. She looks so much like Benjamin, Charles," said the old lady and fixed her gaze on her grandson. "Did you find the one you were looking for? Well, take care of her." The man nodded gratefully and took his girlfriend under his arm and led her to meet the rest of the family. Noah consulted peacefully on the couch after his extravaganza celebrating the birth of his sons. Jacob helped set the table for Nancy and Grandma and keeping an eye on the little ones. 7 years old, Charles said, and drew 2 pairs of eyes. "This is the Smirnoff family, my girlfriend and future bride," said the boy, and the blue poured out in paint. "Nice to meet you. I'm Nancy, Charles's little sister and twin to this splinter right here," smirked the blonde, pointing her finger at her unconscious brother. "This is my husband, Jacob." "Nice to meet you," Eugenia said firmly. "I'm glad Charles has such a large and happy family. I hope you will be a part of it." Nancy replied with a warm smile. Come on, let's go help me chat, girls. Jacob walked over to his not favorite in the Smith family and looked in his wife's direction. Now will you finally stop being ugly and become white and fluffy? Asked Marlo with a laugh at Charles. As long as there's a policeman in our house, I'll be that freak, Smith said. And they both laughed angrily. In fact, Charles and Jacob got along quite well. Some evenings they would sit on the terrace and, sipping whiskey, chat about common topics. After Charles had solved all the illegal issues in the family company, Jacob began to treat him with more respect, but they often teased each other, feigning a fake dislike. Does she really fit your mother's description? Well, according to Grandma's stories, of course, Jacob said, scrutinizing her blue face. She came down to me from heaven like an angel. I almost ran her over in the parking lot outside the business center. Charles smiled. Couldn't get past a woman who looked so much like my mother. It's fate. Smith. Noah jumped up from the couch and approached the men. They turned away from him unhappily. It was Noah who was burned out. Stay away from the twins for at least a couple hours. Charles smirked. Better yet, don't come near any of us. Laughter echoed through the living room. And the girls who had been witching in the kitchen turned sharply. If you're having fun, I'm going to make you chop vegetables for salad now, muttered Nancy, and the men looked at her jokingly, resentfully. Don't look at me so I mean. What's the matter? Jacob asked fearfully. You're worried about Sam. It's a girl, and her name will be Cindy. When are you going to remember? Nancy shouted and put her hand on her already bulging belly. She was 5 months pregnant, and she and Jacob had decided not to find out the sex of the baby until after it was born. That was why they were constantly at odds with each other. Jacob wanted to name his son after his father, and Nancy wanted to name her daughter after the mother she loved so much. And anyway, the only thing that bothers me here is you kicked the blonde out and turned her back on her husband. Well, sunshine, Jacob muttered and moved toward his wife. What a heel, laughed Noah, and behind his back immediately sounded a ringing shout. Noah, if you do not wake up from your hibernation now, I will do something to you. Kelly came out into the living room, followed by Molly, smiling, wide-eyed. I'm up, Noah exclaimed, moving toward his wife. What was standing in the doorway? You're the only heel here. Charles whispered in Noah's ear, and he shook his head unhappily. You said something, Charles. Cynthia came up behind him and put a hand on his shoulder. You shouldn't call names. And the living room rang again. Laughter, sound, happiness, joy, and contentment. They had achieved a happy ending. Now you can die, Molly said quietly under her breath, and hurried off to her grandchildren. Subscribe and click the bell. Stephen was a boss who suits most of his subordinates. First and foremost, of course, was the paycheck. He not only paid people as much as he promised when they joined the firm, but everyone knew that in time, if it did not become a cashier, the line could count on a solid increase. There was a system of fines, but you had to seriously screw up to have some amount deducted from your income. Besides, the boss was not in the habit of humiliating those who worked for him, and overtime loads were always warned, and it was generously rewarded. But if not to abuse trust, the chief could always be asked off. One of the employees, who had a sick daughter for several months in a row, then broke down, then to take the child to take tests, then to pass a neuro specialist, then go to the procedures. But when the girl recovered, the mother went out of her way to do her job as best as possible and justify the trust. And finally, Stephen, although he was a middle-aged man, looked quite pleasant. Slim, trim, smiling. Surprisingly, he was still unmarried, although he had had numerous affairs. Only once had he been frank and admitted that he had grown up in an orphanage, so it was harder for him than others to start a family. He has no experience of living in one. The educators really wanted me to be adopted, he said, because I had good parents, young, intelligent geologists who worked as geologists and died in an expedition. and there were no relatives who were ready to take the child. But I came to the orphanage as an adult. I was 12 years old, and potential parents always look at babies, preferably even infants, so I was never anyone's first choice. And yet Stephen was a prime example that even a child from an orphanage can achieve a lot. He had a big house in the best part of the city, a successful company by the river, and a branch office ready to open. Needless to say, he had a magnificent car, a small but very comfortable yacht. Overseas travel novels at Stephen happened often, but did not end in anything serious. So the ladies knew from the start they had nothing to count on. However, they were not offended. Generous friends showered them with gifts and kept good relations with all of them. The more the staff was interested in a non-standard situation, when a new employee, Molly, came to the staff. She was a very young girl. She had just turned 19 years old. She studied by correspondence, and there were already several successful examples when the chief gave way to such young talents. As they say, put them on the wing. Molly was pretty with dark hair, huge eyes, and that nose. Her family was clearly not rich, and the staff had no doubt that the new girl would not last long. In a week, she would become the chief's new mistress. She was not even condemned, but quite understood. You have to feed yourself, girls. As long as she is not replaced by another girl, the chief's favor is guaranteed. But here's the amazing thing. Week after week, month after month, and no love story in sight. Although Stephen was clearly flirting with Molly, complimenting her, giving her signs of attention. But the girl behaved so restrained, responded to the chief with such deference that he felt Lennon. Does she really think he is so old that she does not even consider him as her boyfriend? But when it was time for the New Year's corporate party, and the staff ordered a meal with delivery from the fanciest restaurant, Stephen still decided to break the resistance without touching. He made sure Molly tried a few cocktails himself. They were very pleasant to taste and yet strong. And then the chief invited the girl to his office. Supposedly he needed help with some paperwork. Persuaded her to have a browder shake of cognac. Then one of the ladies furtively pulled the cabinet handle and snidely informed the others it was locked. All the same, our Michael got to know the chief's comfy couch. When after a while the couple joined the others, it was clear that the inevitable had happened. The chief was extremely pleased, and Molly was as red as a peony and wouldn't look anyone in the eye. The corporate party turned out to be wonderful. Guest artists performed. The food was amazing, and the people stayed up late when they finally started to leave. The chief said that he would personally drive Molly home, and the girl saw a woman in the doorway, whom the guard didn't want to let in. Molly's mom was rushing to meet her. "What took you so long?" the woman said with a soft rebuke. "I've been worried sick. I thought something was wrong. Finally, I couldn't stand it. I took a cab and came." The woman was dressed very modestly. Some shabby, artificial fur coat, boots, which in the market contemptuously called goodbye, youth, a white scarf. On the black-assed hair, Stephen gazed intently at the stranger and the review. Before them was Christina, the wife of his wayward friend Benjamin, with whom at one time he had been in love, and himself. Stephen had once had great difficulty adjusting to life in an orphanage. He grieved for his parents. He was a polite, sensitive, homely boy. He did not know how to stand up for his interests. Now he found himself in completely different conditions. The orphans took every opportunity to mock him, to take away something, to leave him hungry in the canteen. Stephen went so far that he cried at night from hunger and resentment. That's when he met Benjamin, who began to protect him. And even their fates were in some ways similar. Both were homesick, though Benjamin's life was so hard that he was hardly better off at home than in the state. Previously, he had lived in an old village house where Benjamin's mother's relatives and grandmother had gathered. Himself with his mother and numerous aunts unmarried, but fond of drinking. The house had fallen almost into disrepair. For many years, no one had neither money nor desire to bring it to the house. True, in the spring they dug a vegetable garden, planted vegetables, potatoes, onions, cabbage. We did it for practical reasons. If we had our own food, we had more money for vodka. Mother drank perhaps less than the others, but she had an irresistible urge to steal. As a little girl, she stole toys, brightly colored ribbons, and candy from her friends. When the girl became older, everyone knew Wendy better not to invite her into the house, or else something not to count. And when Benjamin went to first grade, his mother went to jail, stole a neighbor's pension she'd received the day before, threw a party at home. And when she didn't have enough money, she threatened another neighbor and demanded more money for booze. Maybe Wendy wouldn't have gotten jail time, but everyone who knew her just prayed that this thief couldn't live in the same village, lock her up somewhere for a few years. Benjamin was given to an orphanage. None of the aunts wanted custody of him. Each had their own reasons for not taking responsibility for the boy. One had an injury, one was out of work. The third one seemed to be going to the city. That's what the aunts told the officials, but they didn't dare tell Benjamin the truth. The boy clung to them, looked into their eyes, begged them to keep him. "You'll live there for a while, and then we'll take you away." The aunts assured him, "We'll get back on our feet and come and get you. There are lots of kids there, plenty of toys. They feed you well, teach you, clothe you, shoe you. Just be patient." At first, Benjamin waited for the aunts to fulfill their promises. He was on duty at the window, ran to every doorbell. But the weeks passed, and Benjamin was not only not picked up, but not even visited. Then the nimble boy began to run home by himself, and as soon as he found his way, he hitchhiked home. He lied to drivers that he was going to his sick grandmother, and they gave him a ride. At home, his aunts and grandmother would grab their heads. They had to call the orphanage to get someone to come and take him back. What is it with you kids? Doesn't anyone watch them? If Benjamin ran away, the aunts were indignant. And the day came when the boy realized it was useless to hope that someone from the family would take him in. The aunts are lying to his eyes. He has to wait for his mother to get out of juvie. She'll take him back home. But Wendy, when she went out to get her son, didn't come back. She quickly got married and moved away. Then, rumor has it, she went back to prison. One way or another, Benjamin never saw her again. Wendy's parental rights were never revoked. Benjamin became bitter and had no more relations with any of his relatives. He now considered the orphanage his true home and began to settle in. Stephen did not know how Benjamin became friends with Christina. It happened before he himself got into the execution walls. It is known that the girl was an abandoned child. She was left at the maternity hospital by a young mother. Then the little girl was transferred to an orphanage, and then she went through all the paths on which such children go. Christina didn't know or even try to find out anything about her parents. She simply did not imagine any other life than in the state walls. She was the smallest and skinniest of the children who had joined the orphanage that year. Benjamin took pity on her as he would a stray and a kitten, and took to protecting her. He made sure she didn't get food taken away from her in the cafeteria. If he himself got something tasty, he gave it to Christina, but that didn't happen very often. No one else dared lay a finger on the girl. And if she was offended by the teachers, with them invariably happened then something nasty. A slip on the stairs, and something slippery, the least of which Benjamin Wine could not prove, though everyone realized it was him. In the end, even the most evil brought up stopped saying little Christina unpleasant things. On the look of the girl was then quite unassuming. She followed Benjamin like a shadow, and so they had as if formed within the walls of the orphanage their own little family. Then Stephen joined it. He himself did not know why Benjamin took pity on him, but he punched Stephen several times so hard to offenders, got a little of his life in the execution walls, and then in the form of the highest form of trust allowed him to be friends with Christina. But as far as school was concerned, Benjamin took a back seat. Stephen had always been a good student. It's true that after his parents died, he dropped out of school for a while. But then he realized that now in life, he would have to make his own way and took up his mind again. He quickly became an excellent student of the school, where the children from the orphanage were studying. But since Stephen helped other kids, and those who couldn't be helped, he let them cheat. He was not teased nerd, on the contrary, tried to make friends with him. This helped the boy to finally fit into the team. Christina, when she went to school, also turned out to be a capable girl. She did not shine in all subjects, but some sciences were given to her surprisingly well. She was sent to the Olympiads in Russian and English. The teacher advised Christina to go further in this field. Maybe a translator. Where can you get a job? Talking to foreigners. It'll start. You have a whole different life. Or at least get a job at a development center. Teach English to kids. You'll make good money. Christina didn't say yes or no. She wasn't talking at all. She still followed Benjamin. She was friendly with Stephen. But it wasn't until the 8th grade that she suddenly looked almost indecently beautiful. She became a real beauty. People were looking at her on the street, but she didn't need anyone but Benjamin. From that moment on, the boys from the orphanage began to fall in love with Christina. They would do anything for her, and now not only Benjamin, but Stephen protected the girl from admirers who were ready for her to walk obediently or jump from the 2nd floor. And Benjamin started stealing. Mother's blood in him, after all. He got in touch with some scumbags who would clean kiosks, steal a passerby's purse, or cut off a girl's purse from her shoulder. And Benjamin himself doesn't seem to have done anything. Needed his share of the stolen goods. He used it to pamper Christina. He bought her chocolates and little things, nooks and crannies, perfume, shoes. What was going on at the orphanage back then? Christina, perfectly aware of where everything came from, was terribly afraid for Benjamin. She cried and said she didn't need any of it. The stuff she couldn't throw away. It was from the hen, but she tried to hide it so the caretakers wouldn't notice. And they almost always noticed anyway. You realize we're covering for you. We don't report you where we should. They reported you to Benjamin because they'll lock you up like your mother. Then you'll be completely lost. We're waiting for you to come to your senses, otherwise you'll go to jail for a long time. And Christina will find another guy. Benjamin looked gloomily at his girlfriend, but she only shook her head. She didn't want anyone else. Benjamin. Really? Stephen tried to influence his friend. We only have a little time left in school. Soon we'll start earning our own money. Then you'll be free to go. You've got good hands. You won't be out of work. By the way, the golden pen was a thief. Looks like Benjamin was cooking. And my hands are golden in the sense that gold sticks to them. Christina brought in some earrings the other day, and it's not hard to hide. She's gonna get out of here and wear them. All that was left was to wave goodbye. But Stephen tried to convince Christina. With Benjamin, you'll get nowhere, he said. You can't depend on him. And if you marry him, he won't change. But Christina couldn't be persuaded. If it wasn't for Benjamin, I might not even be alive anymore, she said. You know, some old ladies are mean, how they mock the younger ones. And I couldn't fight back. If Benjamin hadn't stood up for me, I'd have been hounded. Well, it's understandable that you're grateful to him. But messing with someone like him is a lifelong commitment. You're capable, talented. You'll get an education if you want to thank him later. You'll have money and opportunities. Is such things measured in money? Christina objected. And what you're saying now, is it decent? He's your friend and you're messing around with his girlfriend. Was I embarrassed? Stephen, I think I want you to do what's best for you. I love him. I just objected. But as it goes, so it goes. And I can't do without him anyway. To Christina's credit, it must be said that she never told Benjamin about the conversations Stephen had with her. And the young people's friendship remained strong until graduation. Shortly before the exams, 2 things happened. Benjamin stole another kiosk to celebrate the parting with friends. He was well aware that their roads would be further apart. And although he had promised his friends 100 times to stop stealing, this time they did not reproach him. They snuck out the window and spent the whole May night in the park. Christina and Stephen drank champagne. They ate expensive chocolates, and Benjamin topped himself up with vodka. Did they discuss plans? Stephen was going to go to a technical university. He had every chance of getting in. No one, neither teachers nor comrades, doubted that he would pass the exams well. "Have you decided where you will go?" he asked Benjamin. He looked regretfully at the bottle, which had little left in it. "And to the 30, he said. It was the former vocational school number 30, which was still not called 30 in the city, although now the school had the proud status of a lyceum. It was still possible to learn to be a bricklayer, plasterer, painter, and other working professions on the list. All the kids in the orphanage went to school there. A few years ago, Benjamin Sturhan's class took a field trip there. It was called Career Guidance. The foreman who took them around the classrooms and workshops whispered to someone, winked at them, and at the end of the event, they were taken to the canteen. Everyone remembered sweet, still warm buns and surprisingly tasty apple kissel for a long time. Stephen suspected that the good food was what had inclined Benjamin to choose the school. "But where are you going?" he asked Christina affectionately. "I thought you were going to be an elementary school teacher." In the teacher's college, Christina would pass by all means, and they're a dormitory, although small, but the scholarship and the opportunity to quickly get a specialty with which you will definitely not be unemployed. In addition, Christina has always loved kids. In the shower, Stephen hoped that the couple in love would share life itself. Schools at different ends of the city. Each would have his own company, his own responsibilities. But Christina and Benjamin just looked at each other. "I'm not going anywhere now," Christina said. Pregnant, Stephen's jaw dropped. He knew, of course, that the orphanage girls were not childishly spinning a romance from their childhood years. But for some reason he thought Christina was different. He dreamed that someday he would take her to the registry office in a white dress, innocent and in love. Christina, however, had already thought of everything. And there was no doubt about that with Benjamin. It would be up to her to think and decide. "I talked to the teacher," she began, looking at Sophia's intertwined fingers. "She started early too. She said she couldn't bear it. We have to get on our feet first." But then she said nothing to the others. "We decided to have a wedding in our dining room at the same time as graduation. But it's a secret for now. You're the first one we're telling. She's a chemistry teacher. Her daughter just got married. She's got a dress hanging at home. She'll bring it so it'll be real. Tell me, what about getting married in a church?" Laughing Benjamin. Christina smiled and shook her head negatively. "And with housing, everything will be solved too. Benjamin's survivor's pension all these years went on the book. Will it be enough for any room? Maybe even an isolated small family. I looked at the ad. We'll take the cheapest one we can find. We'll have time to renovate before the baby's born." Stephen bit his lip, and he only finds out about everything now, when his friends have already decided everything. Not that they'd kept it from him on purpose. It's just that they probably didn't think it was any of his business, so they didn't see fit to share it before. So the farewell in the park, which Benjamin had intended as a joke, turned out to be the real thing. In the days they were still to spend at the orphanage, Stephen saw his friends much less often. He pretended that he was immersed in books and studying hard for his exams. In reality, he just hated seeing Christina and Benjamin. He realized that they were both innocent, but at the same time, he felt in his heart that they had betrayed him. They felt something and tried not to impose themselves. They had no time to go to so much trouble before the wedding. But Stephen didn't go to the graduation or the wedding. He agreed that the director gave him his certificate earlier than everyone else and without any solemn ceremonies. The following days, he consoled himself with the fact that he had only 2 4s, the rest of the A's, that his orphanage buddy had gone to school to become a plumber and bought a shabby family in the oldest neighborhood in the city, and Stephen has a survivor's pension too. A good one. And he still had his parents' apartment, which they rented out while he lived in the orphanage. This also brought a considerable amount of money into the account. Was there something to start life with? In the uni, Stephen passed with ease, bought his first car, and swore to himself that he would definitely spin out. He plunged into his studies, as they call it, with his head, and soon stood out among his classmates. But most of all, Stephen was eager to get acquainted, to look around, to see where he should go after graduation. That's what he needed most of all. He defended himself with a red diploma and got a place in a very promising company. The program even included overseas internships, if Stephen wanted to. With his abilities and diligence, he would probably become no less than a deputy director, but he himself did not wish it. And after a few years, having gained experience, he started his own firm. He had to start all over again, only to work with 10 men against the former. But Stephen, clenching his teeth, did not give up. In his apartment, he appeared only late at night, and then for 4 hours to sleep. He recalled later that once he was so tired that he fell asleep in the corridor on a bench when he took off his shoes. In the morning, he woke up, put on his shoes, and hurried downstairs. He was already late for a client meeting. But there was more than just working with maximum dedication. Gradually, the money was coming in as well. He began to allow himself things he'd never dreamed of before. Not only while living in the orphanage, but also before, when his parents were still alive. Vacationing in foreign resorts every time he discovered a new country. Favorite restaurants, which he now visited regularly, club, where he had friends, and of course, women. He found them without difficulty. After all, he was young, good-looking, charming, and becoming more and more wealthy. With his former buddies he did not meet, there was neither time nor desire. But he did not let them out of his sight completely. He knew that Benjamin was drinking more and more, and Christina gave birth to a boy. The baby was born prematurely and had some kind of abnormality. Instead of breast milk, he needs a special expensive formula, which of course, there's no money for. Stephen has his assistant get an address for Christina and her husband. And since the couple had no bank cards, he sent Christina a money order. Knowing her character, he assumed that she could return the entire amount, although she was in dire need of it. Therefore, the transfer was practically anonymous, from an addressee with an unfamiliar surname, with a note from a distant relative. Thank God Christina accepted the money. She must have been under a lot of pressure. 2 years later, the couple had a second son. Benjamin worked wherever he could. His hands were really good. He was willingly hired, but not until the next binge. So soon he stopped looking for a place in his hometown. The notoriety ran ahead of him. Now he went to work somewhere far away, then to Siberia, then to the north, then to the Far East. Sometimes he brought back good money, and sometimes he disappeared. And then Christina had to look for him, call and write to anyone she could to get a trace of him. It was especially hard for her. If the children were sick or something else happened that required an urgent investment of money, and yet a miracle happened in Christina's life. She really found a distant relative who at one time and insisted that the young mother signed a waiver of the baby. Where now was this mother? No one could say Nancy found Christina. She herself lived in another city. Couldn't make it. She was very sick, almost never got out of bed, and she didn't want to see her. The woman felt she didn't have long to live and only wanted to clear her conscience. A little redemption. Maybe if Vanessa had taken you in, she would have come to her senses, Nancy said over the phone. But I thought at the time that she couldn't handle the baby, that it would be on us, the family. And what did we do to deserve such a burden? I've had bad legs for years. It's not even easy for me to look after myself. Vanessa, my mom's remarried. She can't take care of her granddaughter. So I said to Vanessa, give her to the state and the orphanage. They will bring her up better than you will. Now I thought it would be possible to accept Christina in the family. And if not, at least visit her at the orphanage. It's not human to do that from time to time. Abandon the child and forgotten. That's what my son said. I'll bequeath him the apartment and the money I managed to put aside. And you a summer house. It's abandoned, but it's a nice place. My son doesn't go there and doesn't want to sell it. He's not very practical. He grew up with me. So in my will, I'll describe the cottage. So in my will, I'll leave the cottage to you. I don't want anything from you. Christina was confused. I've never even seen you. You don't owe me anything. It will be easier for me to go to the other world, said Nancy, if I know that I took care of you in some way. So if you want to sell the cottage, if you want to bring it up to date, and take the children there for the summer, it's up to you. In short, I warned you not to be too surprised when you get your inheritance. Why don't you two live a little longer? Don't get your hopes up, you cut me off. But God grant you happiness. I'm sorry. What's my fault? With these words, she hung up the phone, and Christina could not recover from the strange conversation for a long time. Meanwhile, the last time Benjamin managed to earn very well, Christina had already got a job by this time. She never managed to finish teacher training school. No, she didn't. She dreamed of working in a library, but it was a utopia. If she was hired without special education, she would get very little. And Christina realized that the times when she became the main breadwinner of a small family would be repeated more and more often. The boys are growing up, they need more and more. And she got a job as a kitchen worker in the city health center, dragged heavy barrels, tray, pots, peeled vegetables. But she always brought home some food in a pot, so I could even save part of my paycheck. How did you decide to give birth in such poverty? Comrades wondered. And two more. Wasn't it wise to wait until you got back on your feet? You can't choose your times. Christina said quietly. So you're also cultured. Why doesn't your husband take pity on you? He sent you to the worst job in the world. He didn't. Benjamin, however, did not insist on Christina working so hard. He'd just give her the money she earned, not forgetting to keep some for himself. And he'd settle down. When would he get his next paycheck? And would Christina have enough with the boys? Until then, it didn't bother him. But for 6 months, he'd been bringing good money back from the north. And Christina made up her mind. Let's sell the room, she told her husband. Add what you've earned. At the very least, we'll take out a small loan and buy a bigger place. What is this? The 4 of us in 15 meters. The second room was occupied by a military wife. He had a child of his own growing up. There were often quarrels between the boys. The women didn't always get along in the kitchen either. The military family had moved in even earlier. That's why both husband and wife felt they were the masters. They didn't like Benjamin drinking and talking loudly when he was home. Turns the TV on full blast. Christina, who grew up in an orphanage, was not a perfect hostess either, and the military wife often reprimanded her for escaped borscht or pasta stuck in the drains, sinks, and pasta. Maybe we'll even have enough for a 2-room apartment. You wish, Christina. Even if it was in any condition with fights, wallpaper, a dead push. I'd bring her home anyway, as long as I had my own place. Beginning of New Year holidays, and very fortunate, was the proposal Christina to work in the countryside year-round in a children's camp. On vacations, there were a lot of children, and in the kitchen labor was in short supply. The most important thing was that Christina could go there with the boys. They'd get a room for everyone and free food. And you will sell our place in the meantime. She admonished her husband. The room is in your name, so you'll have to sign the papers anyway. Be careful and don't drink, please. When you find buyers, call me. I'll see what they're offering you. The New Year holidays flew by in a flash. The vacations that followed also flew by like a blink of an eye. Although the Christina children were still young, they enjoyed walking in the winter woods, exploring the playground, sliding down the slides in the evenings. Christina would bring a big bowl of hot rolls, sprinkle them with sugar, and the kids would fly them away. Watched cartoons. What could be better than that? Finally, when the people began to disperse, Christina saw her husband at the gate of the camp. It alarmed her at once. Why didn't he call, but came right away? And why did he look so strange, averting his eyes? Of course, with Benjamin one could always expect anything. But Christina was frightened in advance. What's wrong? Shouted out, before she could even run up to her husband. Do you understand? He continued to look away. It's this kind of thing. What's the matter? You can tell me I've been offered a good deal, but I think I'm in trouble. Christina slumped exhausted on a snow-covered bench. It turned out that Benjamin was his best friend, whom he knew so well from his work up north. They offered to trade him a room, but a cool foreign car. You sign a deed of gift for us, and tomorrow we'll race you the car and go to draw up all the documents for it. The car was shown in a photograph. It looked very presentable. And although Benjamin could not drive and did not know the brands, he was convinced that the exchange for him will be the most favorable. You will resell it in no time. The buddies assured him. She is worth 3 times more than your villain with hands will tear off. And then you'll have no problem buying an apartment. See for yourself. You can sell a room like yours for 6 months. There's no conditions, no repairs, and we check everything in a matter of days. It's a rare surprise for you. Benjamin finally fell for it and signed the deed of gift. Christina and the kids were registered at a different address. They decided to do it in advance to make the sale quicker and easier. And now it's played against them. The room went into the hands of Benjamin and their friends, no car. And the next day, naturally, the guy didn't get one. He waited for 24 hours. Others on the third with difficulty got through to one of the men. I'm sorry, dear, it's such a nuisance. He began to justify himself. The car had an accident and is being repaired. What about it? Benjamin was confused. My guys are coming back soon. Where would they go? Let's cancel the deed of gift. Don't worry. He'll fix your car up good as new. There's no way to cancel the deed. We've already bought your room. He's a very serious man. You better not argue with him, or they'll put you on the knife. It all seemed like a bad dream. Benjamin ran to his old address. The military wife, who had hated him before, literally clung to him. Benjamin, what have you done? The perfect thug and his family moved in. I'm walking through a wall now. Even my husband can't say a word to him. You can't get protection from the state yet. He won't even think about it. He'll just cut him, and that's it. Benjamin, come back. Cancel the deal. I won't say another word against you. Not to you or your wife. So what do we do now? It was the first time she'd ever seen her husband so confused. Should we go to a lawyer or something? You're smart. Give me a hint. You've ruined my life, Christina said quietly. Stephen told me right then, no matter how much I fight with you, it's all for nothing with this untimely pregnancy. You robbed me of my future. I could have gone to school and done something with my life. And when children were born. And so it went. Why do you see everything black? Benjamin said angrily. His wife had reproached him for almost the first time in his life, and he didn't like it. Have we lived so badly with you? Another man wouldn't earn as much as I brought you. Sometimes you agreed, and then nothing for 6 months. I moved from place to place, or a job worthy of you did not turn out, or friends cheated. Like now, they got money from the customer for all of them, and divided it among themselves, and they told you if the customer was a scoundrel who didn't pay. I know these cases, I called them. They don't tell you anything to the people you worked for. Everything was paid to the penny. Only Tabakov's Ering has that money stuck to his hands, and when his son Dimka asked you to take a loan for a week until payday, you took it out on yourself, believing that Dimka would pay the money himself. But he couldn't fool a fool like you. He forgot the loan to his brother, how much 90,000 there was. They wouldn't have allowed you to put the room on the market with the bank debt. I'm the one who paid it off. Benjamin was living at the door, while you were up north, cleaning out dumpsters. Cool, yeah, I was gonna lend books to libraries. I wanted to go to theaters, meet cultured people. Benjamin took offense. So you think I'm a physical therapist? Yeah, you were only good when you were brought to the orphanage alive, frozen, and everyone was trying to slap you around. I remember that. Christina looked him straight in the eye. That's why I put up with it for so long. and never said anything to you, never reproached you with anything. And now you don't want to put up with it anymore. Well, look for a cultured man who will take you to the theaters." Benjamin put his hands in his pockets and walked away without looking back. He even seemed to be booed. Christina realized that she had deeply hurt his manhood, knew, too, that he was going nowhere, that he might not have a place to sleep tonight. On the other hand, he hadn't asked where she and the kids would go from here from camp either. For a few days, Christina could have stayed with some of her friends, but now there was uncertainty ahead, and you can't burden strangers with your family for too long, especially when you have children. That's when she remembered about the aunt for luck and realized that she seemed to have no other way out. Her aunt said that her husband had once built a house so that she could live in it in winter. There's a stove or something. According to the owner's plan, the family was to spend New Year's and Christmas at the cottage. The nature around is gorgeous. The last days she could spend in the camp. Christina asked another kitchen worker to look after her boys and went for a reconnaissance. The news was both bad and good. The cabin was in disrepair, and it was a long walk to the nearest store. None of the neighbors were staying there for the winter. And this silence around was frightening. What if there was an unkind person nearby, and there was no one to call for help? On the other hand, the house had 2 rooms and a kitchen. There was no stove, but the dacha had light, heaters, the most necessary furniture, and even a small stock of food. Christina decided to take a risk. All day she cleaned the cabin, as she could make it cozy, and then brought the boys here. They were delighted when they realized the situation, so now they have their own house. In the garden you can sculpt a snowman, build your own slide, and no angry neighbors nearby. Now no one will constantly scold them, demanding that they do not run and make noise. Christina had a little money set aside, but she realized that she would not be able to live on this amount for long. Knowing Benjamin's character, she had no doubt that there was no help from him. Alimony, what kind of alimony, if he officially does not work anywhere and travels to all sorts of coven? She had the idea to go to the very girl for whom she paid the loan. It was very convenient for him to just forget about the debt. But Christina knew that with a probability of almost 100% she would not achieve anything. According to rumors, Damashka lived with a girl who fully supported him. He himself preferred to lie on the couch and not work. He'd say, "Fuck you. If your husband's such a sucker, why did he believe me? It's not my fault." And several evenings in a row, Christina, until late at night, sat near the boys and thought her sons were open to her joke. Though the laughter was artificial, it was warmer. Christina was terribly afraid of catching the boys' cold. How to treat in such conditions? It is impossible to call a doctor. In the end, there was another kind soul who agreed to look after the children. And Christina went to the city to see if she could count on a remote job. The last years she learned to do needlework quite well, sewing and knitting toys. Unusual, original, colorful. From her more than once bought kittens, puppies, a pony, and a dragon. The earnings, of course, tiny, but still. Christina knew a store that sold handmade products. Here came those who were tired of consumer goods and wanted something special. The negotiations with the owner were successful. Christina showed her pictures of her toys. She left a few animals. She wanted to go shopping for cheaper groceries, even though she knew she'd have to carry a heavy bag a long way. And she couldn't believe her eyes when she saw Stephen. She never thought she could run into him like that on the street. If she hadn't known him so well, she probably would have passed him by. Nothing else gave him away as a former orphanage boy who was happy just to have a piece of bread. An expensive coat, a groomed look. He came out of some institution on the main street. Christina hesitated for a moment, then caught up with the man and touched his sleeve. "Stephen, is that you?" He recognized her at once, though she realized she didn't look like much. Haggard, probably age. No makeup. Only her lips were painted with cheap red lipstick, so as not to look pathetic. But Stephen was genuinely pleased. There was no doubt about that. He bombarded her with questions. how she was here, and how long had she come alone or with her family, and how were she and Benjamin doing. Christina made no secret of it and told him that they were probably separated for good. She had never seen Stephen so excited. He suggested we sit somewhere and talk because you're going to lose your son again for 1,000 years, and I won't know where to find you. Christina looked at her watch and thought she would catch the last train. She had always felt so safe and secure with Stephen. Maybe now he could give her some good advice. He led her to a small, elegant restaurant and very tactfully placed her order. He realized that Christina would look at the menu with the French names of the dishes, about the way a goat would study a new gate, and they started with wine. Christina drank her glass in one gulp. She just wanted to calm down. That this was high-end ice cream, wine and pleasure was supposed to stretch. It hadn't even occurred to her. Sturhan didn't say much about himself. He only mentioned that his business was fine. He came here on a business trip. Married. Christina asked him straight out. She thought that someone might see her and Stephen. And if an old friend had a family, he could be in trouble. No, he shook his head with a sad smile. I haven't fallen in love with anyone yet. Why would I want a loveless marriage? I can have fun without a stamp in my passport. But Stephen asked about everything in detail, and the wine loosened her tongue. Benjamin left his kids outside in the winter, you know. He didn't even ask us where we were going or look for us. If he'd been running around my girlfriends, they'd have told me. No, he doesn't care. He was always sure I'd get my family out of any trouble, and the kids wouldn't be lost with me. I warned you. I quietly told Stephen this would happen. That's the way it is, not the other way around. Now I have to get down on my knees and apologize to you. Steriani, you were right. I was wrong. I was stupid. Only now it's too late, and you'll do something. Stephen asked. I'll plant a vegetable garden till spring. I'll feed myself somehow. Maybe work on David's dacha at home. I'll sell it. And me and the boys will move back to the city in some room. Where will you go at night now? Stephen said thoughtfully. There's someone to look after the children till morning. Let's go and spend the night. What am I in the hotel? Christina, inwardly aghast at the surprise of this proposal, and for the first time in her life waved at everything. And she was not. She called an acquaintance who was watching the children and said she would come in the morning. The acquaintance was a young girl, a student. She could stay the night at the cottage. Christina said they would pay her double. At first, Stephen tried to play the selfless friend, who was ready to give Christina his bed in the hotel suite and himself to sleep on the sofa. But they woke up together in King's Ice's wide bed. Stephen thought Christina was still asleep, and she was watching him from under the floor cover. By now, she knew for certain that she didn't love Stephen and could never love him. Even now, Benjamin worried her more. Meanwhile, Stephen had pulled several large bills from his wallet and quietly placed them in Christina's purse. It was enough to still challenge her with shame and hatred for him. She had been paid for a night of lovemaking as a person of easy behavior. Just as Stephen disappeared into the shower and the sound of running water was heard, Christina slipped out of the room. She was in such a hurry that she put on her coat and boots in the hallway. He wouldn't find her there, and he wouldn't even think of looking for her if her own father did not dare to come to them even once, although theoretically he knew where the dacha was. At home, Christina appeared immensely guilty, immediately let the assistant go, paying her more than enough. And all day long she fiddled with the boys. Then there were a few very different days when all three of them, but they kept their heads down. Christina sowed her own bears or seeds. She told the boys stories and thought about the fact that if she had to winter here another winter, the house would have to be insulated for sure. She didn't feel well, but she put it down to depression. She wanted to lie down and cry. Christina kept thinking about how tired she was of the vicissitudes of life, how mercilessly fate had treated her, exactly all the time tested for strength. Others had it so hard, much easier. She had never had a chance to get a grip, to get out of poverty. Christina lay with her back turned to the wall. Her eyes were closed and tears were streaming down her cheeks. "Mom, why do you sleep all the time?" Her eldest son John was rubbing her. "What do you want?" "Christopher and I want to eat." Christina forced herself to get up. Boiled potatoes in a jacket pot, chopped finely onions, poured lean butter, or fried pancakes. It was their usual meal. If the boys were not hungry, they did not pester her. They felt something. Did Christina eat? She didn't feel like eating, and she only drank tea, trying to save not more than 1 spoonful of Sahara in a cup. Her sons didn't recognize unsweetened tea, and the store was far away, and she didn't want to go there at all. "But if we run out, we'll have to." Benjamin found them and came back empty-handed. And hungry, he didn't bring the boys anything, not even caramels. But his sons still hung on to him. Benjamin smiled confusedly. Of course, he didn't solve the problem or even try. He wondered if Christina was still mad at him. And maybe she had thought of something herself. "Mom, let Dad eat." John took off like a rocket and carried everything back to his father's. "I had to cook pasta on the stove." "Where do you live?" In a neutral voice, Christina asked, while Benjamin ate. He shrugged, not lifting his eyes from his plate. "When at your friend's? How can they stand your drinking?" "When I just sleep in the entrance," he continued, "one or the other. Because they're already chasing me out of there." He grinned. Christina offered to have fun with that too. "Would you go to your north?" she said tiredly. "There you'll find a place in a wagon, but you won't go hungry. You told me that the watchmen eat in a bargain and pour you a bowl of soup. You just want me to earn money for the apartment faster. That's why you're hounding me." "No," I shook my head. "I don't need your money anymore. They don't bring happiness. They take it away." Benjamin was quiet. For a few seconds. "Christina, forgive me," he said at last. You could see how hard it was for him to say those words. Men hate to apologize, to admit they're wrong. There is even an anecdote about a man who seemed to say sorry, but actually said sheet. But Benjamin was silent, so he really did apologize in front of her. "You'll ask your sons for forgiveness when they're older," Christina said, "for leaving them homeless. I don't want anything from you. You despise me." Pulling away. She devoted herself by the elbows. "Just like shutting yourself off from him. Live your life as you wish. Be happy if you can. But don't you dare ruin my life again. I'll get my kids back on their feet." "What about you, Benjamin?" looking around at more kitchens. "This is where you'll live. Maybe I can stay with you too, but until spring. But not for long. I don't really have anywhere to live. My friends are boring the hell out of me. No jobs come up yet. I could be useful here. Shoveling snow after all. Insulate the house or something. You know I can do anything." "Yeah," she said slowly. "You can do anything." His plate was already empty. Christina went to the door and opened it. "Go." She was small and thin compared to him, but he didn't dare to contradict her. He never took off his jacket. It was cold in the house. He pulled up the zipper signal and put on Christina's hat. "But if anything, you'll need it from outside. You know the number." Still got the phone. Strangely left the SIM card, he admitted. "I'll get rich and buy a new phone. And myself. And the boys." "Go," she repeated and locked the door behind him. She was sure she was afraid he might come back, shutting him out like an enemy. And a few days later, Christina realized she was pregnant and was challenged by terror. She didn't wonder who the child was from, Benjamin or Stephen. She'd lost both of them anyway. And she wouldn't connect her life with either of them. But what was she to do now? She realized that she would give birth to this baby and pull it with all her might. But would it be enough? Had the orphanage changed something in her? Now she couldn't deny anyone the right to live. If a wasp flew into the room, Christina would pick it up with a toppled towel and throw it out the window, watching the wasp fly away. She would never step on a bug that knew the way. It was sentimentality on the verge of idiocy. But though life had toughened her up, she couldn't do it any other way. now had to walk to town almost every day. Though like almost every pregnant Christina wanted to lie down and doze. Instead, she looked for buyers for the dacha, found out prices for housing, and here she was lucky almost for the first time in her life, offered in exchange for a house with a plot. Christina received a one-bedroom, let on the outskirts. The apartment had to be brought to mind. But the young woman almost did not cry from happiness. We got the apartment from my grandmother. They told my wife to sign the documents. We wouldn't live there anyway. And in such a neighborhood, you can't rent it for a decent sum. And your cottage has such a wonderful place. The forest is close to the river. We'll use the cabin as a time, and we'll start building ourselves. Christina hurriedly signed the papers the notary gave her. She was afraid that everything would be taken away from her. But nothing was taken away. On the contrary, everything was left. Even the furniture. Christina perceived it as happiness. After all, not so long ago she had nothing of her own. And now she had a sideboard with dishes, and a round table covered with a knitted tablecloth, a bed for her and a sofa for the boys, and in the closet even an old linen stack. No, spouses who gave up such wealth were truly crazy. The lucky streak continued. Christina went to the family services office just to see if she'd get anything with 3 kids. Every penny was now a penny's worth. And they offered her a job. They were all over her at the Children's Rehabilitation Center. They needed a night nurse. No one agreed to spend the nights constantly looking after other people's children. Nannies agreed to night duty reluctantly, almost scandalously. And Christina had the same tears of gratitude to fate. It's not like carrying heavy cans in the kitchen. She surprisingly came to this job and often thought about how lucky the children in the rehabilitation center. Compared to those kids who went straight to boarding schools, the small building, converted from a former kindergarten, was cozy and warm. The groups were small, and in the rooms the pupils lived 2 by 2. They were fed to their heart's content and tasted good. Maecenas constantly gave something to the center, then toys, then new fluffy, huge carpet in the game room, then a big TV, a real movie theater. But the fates of the children remained the same as many years ago. And this girl was left alone because she has only her mother, and she is being treated for tuberculosis, probably will not recover. The little brother has a sister and his parents are drug addicts who abandoned their children long ago. They were raised by their grandmother and starved in the center. They couldn't wean them from carrying bread from the canteen and hiding it under the mattress behind the radiator. This boy has only a grandmother too. Wouldn't even send him to school. Some kind of sectarian. She thought they'd teach him bad things. And Leshka was herding goats in the woods instead of studying. He came to the center as wild as Mowgli. Christina saw these children in the evening, and early in the morning another nanny came to pick them up. But in the evenings, Christina sat with the kids in the playroom and read them books or told them stories. The teachers thought that this would not interest their children. Cartoons, yes. But the guys somehow instinctively realize that Christina is the same as they have passed the same school of life, speaks the same language, and they flew to her as in a box. Plus, she was a great storyteller. What tormented Christina was that her own children were left unattended at this time. True, John had been well taught to lock the door, check it before bedtime, and not open it for strangers. Still, the neighborhood is far in few things. But the superintendent was so pleased with Christina's work that she allowed her, when there were places in the center, to bring the boys in the evening and tuck them in the spare room, and the cook in the kitchen often offered the young woman to take the food in the day room with her. The children here were fed to slaughter, and much was left over. About Benjamin, Christina knew nothing and had no intention of finding out. She was sure she was doing the right thing, and now God was helping her. Yes, she bought going to the hotel with Stephen. But he wasn't married. She hadn't taken him away from anyone, and she was already punished for what she had done. Christina was well aware of what she was going through, until the baby she'd been promised at the ultrasound got back on her feet. As for Benjamin, better no father than one like that. Christina will not let him take anything away from her anymore. for her and the children. Her former sense of awe and gratitude for what he had once done for her now vaporized without a trace. Now, Christina was a mother first and foremost, and she took it from there. And then they found her and told her that Benjamin had died in the first minute. She didn't believe it and thought it was a prank, to make up for it. But the man in front of her with his hat in his hand told her everything. Benjamin had enlisted up north after all, and he'd gone as far as he'd ever gone before. As far as Yamelmenitz, that's where he caught a cold. Probably went in the same jacket that he used to come to her dacha. Before, as a janitor, he was always given thick coats, nicknames for newcomers. But the ones they had were gone along with the room. And the new Benjamin probably didn't have time to get one or got one before he drank it. Anyway, he got pneumonia, which at first he proudly despised and went to work with a fever. Then he was taken away by ambulance as he was no longer thinking anything and was delirious. A week later, Benjamin died in intensive care. Guest, did you ask what to do with the body? They're not officially divorced, so it's up to the wife. How did you find me? Christina asked. It was very difficult along the chain. A few days just hanging on the phone, admitted the man. You could spit on everything and say to bury Benjamin in the city where he died. But would Christina's sons forgive her for that? And she gave almost all the money she earned to bring her husband, and very modestly, but buried in the local cemetery. And there was a funeral service, and she brought candy and cakes to the rehab center. At the wake, everything was honored. Now the children would know where their father's grave was. Christina shrugged her shoulders, feeling like a horse on which an exorbitant burden was put on a donkey. In such a situation would stand up and cannot stand, and the horse pulls from the last strength, and you have to be a donkey, otherwise you'll fall off. And then who to entrust the children to? Christina arranged with the superintendent that her boys would stay at the center while she was in the maternity ward. The girl Molly was born easily. Christina held her daughter in her arms and thought she was the most beautiful of her 3 children. A porcelain doll with dark eyebrows, eyelashes, and side-drinking hair at the orphanage. One girl had a German doll like that. How they all envied her. But it turned out to have the same vice as the rest of the kids, breast milk intolerance. Again, we had to pay for expensive formula. Christina herself was sometimes surprised at how conscious her boys were growing up. The same Christopher is still 2 tops from the pot, but already ready to look after his sister and change the film and hold the bottle. While the baby eats, Christina bought a screen door and created a corner for her and the baby. She tried to keep her daughter at night so that she would not cry and would not disturb the boys' sleep. And the boys were ready to nurse their little sister during the day, so that the mother could sleep at least an hour. That's how we had to live, clenching our teeth and work, work, work. Then life would sooner or later get back on track. When Molly went to kindergarten, Christina studied by correspondence and became a teacher, but she didn't want to leave the center. She said that working with troubled children paid more. But that was not the only reason. These kids needed her more than anyone else. When another child was brought to the center, he always cried and dreamed of going home. And the teachers would say the usual words, "Look how nice it is here, how many toys, and how many friends you will have with whom you will play here. Here's a pie, and don't cry." Christina had her own way with everyone. She'd just give them a hug and let them cry. Some she promised to go to their mom and arrange for her to come on Sunday. And no one's children are drawn to her, as it happens, a child from the center. Will he return to his family or send him, God forbid, to an orphanage? But even there, the guys remembered Christina, and they wrote her letters and called her to come visit. And some of them she visited. She was tormented by a feeling of guilt in front of her own children for the fact that they had no father, that they always lived hard and poor. Though Christina remained, as they used to say of the people, did what she could for them. Looking ahead, once a gypsy guessed Christina that the fate of one of her sons will be such that no one expects, but nothing bad will happen to him. inquired Christina, though to believe such predictions was at least foolish. No, no, assured the gypsy. It's just that he's special to you. Give him to us in the tabor, and we like him that way. But Christina only shook her head fearfully, and since then, she herself began to look closely at the edge. Slightly out of childhood, the boy took an interest in playing the guitar. First, someone in the yard showed him 3 chords. Then Christina bought her son a cheap instrument for his birthday, with which he never parted, and extracted from this guitar everything it was capable of. He had much more fanaticism than the kids who were put in music school by their parents and put up with this hard labor in order not to upset their ancestors. And then Christopher, fabulously lucky, his buddy, whom rich parents dreamed to see comprehensively developed, so launched music lessons, so by hand led from the specialty of choir and solfeggio, that his frustrated and distressed mother gave her son's guitar expensive imported. Frames Take My Numbskull will no longer take in his hands. The instrument refused decisively. And you have eyes for this case. I can see that. And Christopher is literally gone. Now no trail, no guitar hangout went by without him. Quickly he was picking up from the others. He practiced techniques by day, and by night he became a true virtuoso. And then he told his mother he was leaving for St. Petersburg. What will you do there? Who is waiting for you there? Christina was confused and frightened. Mom, what kind of life awaits me here? Christopher, please. He also pressed his hand to his chest. It was a gesture she had never seen from him before. I never got to go to music school, and now it's too late. Yes, we have a music school, but without school I will not get there. And apart from music, I'm not interested in anything else in life. But I'll have to learn something, get a profession. I'll have to feed myself. So, I hate engineering. Economics too. I'll just ruin my life. If I stay here, we'll let you go. And Christina gave up. She just said, guiltily, but everything is so expensive there, and I can't feed you and support you in another city. You know, you don't need anything. Mom, I'll do it myself. Don't worry about me. And don't be sad that we're splitting up. I'll keep coming back. He went to Peter and for 6 months sent only short messages that he was alive and well, and everything was fine. Yeah, he called a couple times, asking about the family. And then Christopher came for a few days, and his family found out that he was now playing in the band, and they were carrying him in their arms. The band is getting more and more popular. There were concerts ahead, touring. Since that time, the novel appeared at home twice a year. He became famous with the musicians. He toured a lot. He was already known abroad. He would visit, and Christina felt indignantly that her son had become a different stranger to her. Their family's simple news was far from him, and the things he told were not at all about the world in which they lived. Christopher was bringing in money that seemed to Christina to be enormous. She refused for a long time, and when he still insisted on his own, his mother took the bills, so that on the very next day, she could quietly put them into the account, which was opened in her son's name by a secret from him. She believed that while she was on her feet, she had no right to use her son's money, and Christopher can make his fabulous earnings unreliable, and not forever. And the day will come when he'll be penniless. That's when she'll give him the savings account. Sometimes Christina timidly asked the novelist if he had a girlfriend and if he was going to get married. I do not insist, my son. I am not one of those to whom you do not put grandchildren. I just like to know, to be happy for you. If anything, you'll tell me. I'll tell Mom. If there's something to say. There's plenty of girls out there. But there's nothing serious in my life, except music, and both mother and son smiled sadly. In this, Christopher was in the rhythm of a one-lover who has not yet met the one who will be the only one for him all his life. Eldest son John was quite different. Christina had always viewed him as her right-hand man. He babysat his little sister too, and didn't shy away from doing women's work. Acquaintances invite Christina. You have and help with the floors, and we'll cook dinner. Where do they get such golden boys? I'll tell you a secret. I got a gift version. Christina was joking around, but the truth is, her heart ached for John all the time. He always thought of others first, and then himself. And today, I guess he couldn't do that. When they went somewhere on the bus, Christina never remembered her son sitting for long. He always found someone to give up his seat. If not an old lady, then a middle-aged woman or even a girl. At school, it was John who the teachers often asked for help. He was unflappable. How will you go to the army? Christina was worried. Everyone will ride you there, and not just those grandfathers. You'll call everyone to lend a shoulder. What fool wouldn't take advantage of that? She remembered the orphanage life too well. If your father didn't know how to stand up for himself, she told her son, we'd both be lost. He protected himself and me. You realize that even goodness must have its fists. I go to the boxing gym. John smiled. It's not enough. There must be somewhere inside you the ability to fight back. If you get hurt, Christina saw her son off to the army. For good. No farewell table. No drinking with relatives. The mother just hung on John's chest and sobbed. Raised such a good, kind, strong man. Would he come back, or would he be broken there? He came back and suddenly announced to Christina that he was going to law school part-time and was going to work for the police. You can imagine he did. He soon calls us a family, a mom and 2 daughters. They live in a private house, and here comes a homeless guy. He just saw that the gate was not on the fence and came in, sat down in their hallway, and said that he wanted to eat and would not leave until he was fed. So they fed him. He said that he liked it here and he would stay, and so they persuaded him. But he wouldn't. Sits there like a king demanding tea. That's when they got on the phone. And when we arrived with the guys and took this young man under our arms, how grateful these poor people were to us. They almost bowed at our feet. They wouldn't have had the strength to cope with him. And then John was sent to Chechnya, simply as a policeman to work for a few months. He went without any desire to leave his mother and sister, and he always thought that his place was in his hometown. And since then, he had been in touch with them for several months. He's been very sparing with his family. Short calls, half-page letters. And in March, Christina got a call that his son was lying in a military hospital. It happens, even though there doesn't seem to be a war. Whoever mutilated her son was never found. Christina forgot everything then. Threw on a t-shirt that she wore as a teenager. Sat by John's bedside in the ward. He was considered almost hopeless. For several months, the fever did not go down. She had no strength not only to get up, not even to sit up in bed. The doctors tried to prepare Christina for the fact that she would lose her son, but without raising her eyes, she stood in the corridor to get plates of hospital lunch, returned to the ward again, fed John from a spoon, did the laundry, did the dirtiest job of a nurse. She also cleaned up after other patients, even though she was so small and thin. She did everything so they wouldn't send her away. They left her here to be a son, and she got what she wanted. John started to get up, started to walk, but he was going to limp for the rest of his life. The fractures were very difficult. But Christina realized she had pulled her son through. For a while, they didn't talk about the future. What would John's health be like from now on? Would he have to be on disability, or would he be able to work as a police officer again? Both were silent on the subject, but Christina noticed that her son had changed a lot. His expression became withdrawn and rigid, as John had never been before, and the son was silent almost all the time, did not read, although before he was a real book to swallow. Now he lay more and more with his hands behind his head, immersed in himself, thinking. Well, finally, at last, Christina began to talk. We'll be going home soon. You'll be discharged next week. You're glad. And then John told her gently, I'm going home. If I go home, it won't be for long. Where do you think you're going? She shrieked involuntarily. You could almost hear the desperation in her voice. After all, I also want to leave me, like Christopher. In the shower. Had she hoped that it was with John that she would live out her life, that her son would forever be her support? No, she would never hang on his neck, would never stop her from arranging her own life. It was just that she had never been afraid around him. She wouldn't be afraid of not incoming old age or disease. John was the kind of man she wanted to have by her side. That being said, Christina swore to herself that no matter who John married, she would not say a word. She would step aside, would not interfere with the young, but on the contrary, would help them in every way she could. Christina never thought that her son would ever leave her. And now he spoke of it himself. "Where are you going, to Moscow or Peter, like Christopher?" "No, Mom. There's a line from an old poem. I want silence. You must have burned your nerves. After what I saw out there, I want to be alone for a while. I got in touch with one of my friends. He's calling me to be a forest ranger. What are you gonna do with a broken leg in a job like that? Let's not get ahead of ourselves." John smiled, trying to distract his mother. "Now I will go home anyway. I will recover, and then we'll see." Christina fervently began to convince her son that he would not be out of work if he did not have to return to the police. "You can go to school, for example, a teacher of labor. John has a law degree. If his leg won't allow him to walk much, he can find a sedentary job in a court or in a private office, as a lawyer's assistant to a notary." John stroked her arm affectionately, but said neither yes nor no. And Christina realized with despair that it seemed that he had already decided everything for himself in his heart. That was a quality that could not be taken away from him. If anything, the subject was wrong in his head. "You just do not hurry," she begged her son. "Stand up first. Maybe not only the leg, but also your nerves under the stomach." He left after 3 months. John did not understand anything about the business he was to do, but was full of desire to learn. He was given a house not even on the outskirts of the village, but as if separate from everyone else. You had to walk to the outskirts. An old house and 2 birch trees. Since then, Christina came to visit her son together with his mother, and once at the girl's request, she left her here for the whole summer. Yes, it was probably the best place to settle her nerves. Silence, just the sound of leaves. Not far from the gate, 2 white goats grazed in the meadow. A rooster was keeping an eye on the hens, and on 3 sides of the road the forest was noisy. Christina saw that her son was changing for the better. He got a real tan, became stronger, began to joke sometimes, and sometimes seemed quite the same. And yet there was a break in him. Christina realized this when she saw her son, in the middle of a lively conversation, can suddenly fall silent again and go into his own unhappy thoughts, even if only briefly for a few moments. And he did get a local girl, and it looked like they were getting married. At least Christina could rest easy about that. The youngest daughter, Molly, turned out to be another gift of fate, rarely pretty. Outwardly, she was not like her brothers or her mother. Polyclinic, and on the playgrounds at school and ballet studio girl admired. But she looked like a doll. That's a phrase that stuck with her mom. She was also an excellent student, and Christina didn't have to go through what she went through with her older children. When the parents of other children hinted to their children that it would not be worth it to get too close to the kids from a dysfunctional family, where the father drinks and the mother, though a hard worker, but from orphanages from such good do not expect good. Molly had many girlfriends, and everything in her life seemed to go smoothly. Her brothers spoiled her. Especially the eldest John constantly made her sister some gifts, always sticking up for her if in the evening she was late for classes in the club or performed on stage. He'd meet her and walk her home. Molly was slow to contact fans, spent her evenings at home. She sewed her own costumes for dance numbers. She inherited her golden hands. True, she was good at women's crafts. She sewed, embroidered, knitted. She graduated from school with a medal, but she chose her profession more than reasonably. "I like to do ballet, but I have no special abilities," she told her mother. "And in this field I will not achieve anything. I'd rather go to college and try to find a job that would make me happy and feed me." Christopher's brother called her to Peter. He rented a good apartment there and promised that she could live with him as long as she wanted. And even if she didn't get in, would it be a bad thing? To visit the northern capital, and he'll show her around. What about your love life? Molly asked jokingly. Christopher shrugged. It's a 2-bedroom apartment. 1 room I'll allocate you, and I'll do without a bedroom and a music studio. But Molly did not accept the invitation and entered the institute in his city. She passed the competition bar easily. Mother did not even have to be nervous. However, it so happened that ties with former friends were interrupted. After school, everyone scattered as if from a gust of wind. Many girls chose large cities, and the university that chose Molly did not enter none. But long alone to stay youth cannot. And Molly had a friend for the first time. And it was a friend and nothing else. The guy was 10 years older than her. He was fat as fuck and had a funny last name, Little. He was a mama's boy, but in a good way. Just felt sorry for his elderly, feeble health, mom, even though she was a terrible bore. But Little got home on time every night, so that mom wouldn't worry. And he was home for both daughter and son, scrubbing floors and shopping. Feeding 2 Persian cats, my mother's favorite. My brother helped mom all the time too, Molly Little said when she got to know him a little better. That's where their betrayal began. And Molly saw Sergey exactly as an older brother. They sat together in classes and went out together in the institute canteen in the evenings. If we had free time and talked about everything in the world, we liked being friends with the MAI guy even more than with the girls. In their conversations, there was no place for idle gossip. He read a lot, had a good sense of humor. They often joked with each other. Molly thought that this relationship would last forever. But then everything changed. Sergey's mother died, and immediately, as if from under the ground, a certain girl came out of the ground who clung to Little with a dead grip. Literally, when she was near Sergey, her hand was worn under his elbow. Castle, where did you find her? Molly asked. They were sitting in lectures. Only at the institute Little was getting freedom from Miss Lena. She worked as a saleswoman in a sporting goods store and looked at Molly with suspicion and almost with hatred. After all, Molly sat half the day in the institute auditorium next to her Sergey. Little shrugged guiltily. Yes, it just happened. She started talking to me on the street. I said, but that's all. She's been my shadow ever since. Molly. She didn't want to believe it would last. She thought Little would be smart enough to stand up for his own freedom. But before he knew it, he was married. And after that, he was finally caught in the grip of the law. Sergey's apartment was sold because Lena found it impossible, too cramped, and the neighborhood is bad. And now to read Little was no time, all thoughts and forces about earning and paying the mortgage on time. With Molly, he could now only meet by chance and chat for a few minutes. Left alone, the girl began to wonder if she had made a mistake. No, it wasn't about her own failure to wrap her head around Christopher as her boyfriend. She'd never really accepted him. But now that she had Molly's degree, she wondered if she was in the right business. Her soul asked for romance. But at work it was numbers, reports, graphs, tables. And so from morning till night. True, the pay was good in the firm where she got a good job. And my friends immediately found my hairdresser that don't go to an expensive salon. Go to Vanessa. Who Molly? I was even confused. To Vanessa, she works at home. But she's a real pro, will make you a human being. Finally realizing that she had to be more decisive, one of the mutual acquaintances simply led her to this very Vanessa by the hand. Vanessa turned out to be a very pretty damsel, about 28 years old. Molly had always distrusted hairdressers. If they couldn't style their own hair and wore the hell out of it. Vanessa looked like a model, a waterfall of flawless blonde hair flowing down her shoulders, makeup, a work of art. At home, a pile of colors, jars, a tube of hair masks and face masks, scissors, 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 scissors. What's a hairdresser's shop? And Vanessa managed to keep up with her young daughter. When she looked at Molly, she rounded her eyes and asked who did that to you. What are you talking about? I don't get it, girl. Vanessa picked up her hair. Dan, she'd recently dyed her hair that color and tried it herself. The light shone over her forehead. Vanessa fiddled with it all day, treated her hair with some imported products, recolored it, suffered from the grove. The end styled my naturally outstanding hair into a hairstyle. For a long time she did makeup, selecting shades with the thoroughness of an artist, a perfectionist. When Vanessa allowed me to look in the mirror, Molly didn't recognize herself. Sitting there was a beauty who had nothing to do with her. Molly, you little office rat, I could put this one on the catwalk right now. After that, Molly, I started coming to Vanessa's. At least once a month. Make an appointment. The hairdresser's schedule was so busy. What about a pop star? My little daughter played in the manage. From time to time, her mother threw her new toys. Vanessa saw her husband once or twice. He worked as a remote programmer. He earned God willing and didn't give the family a penny. Lost all his money. Luck never turned his way once, but he never gave up trying to please this capricious lady. In the meantime, Vanessa kept the family together. Why didn't she try to free herself? Didn't shake off her husband like ballast that kept her from sailing on the sea of life? At ease. That's what she couldn't understand. As if there was in Vanessa something from an Oriental woman who a priori believes that the man is superior and he must be obeyed. And now Molly could not look at the blonde beauty without a slight feeling of pity. She herself constantly caught admiring glances. Sometimes she turned around, and it was pleasant. And no one knew that in the evenings she lay behind her screen and read fairy tales. Yes, rereading her children's books and dreaming of falling in love. Just like the Little Mermaid. One day her mother came into her cubbyhole. She sat on the edge of the bed, stroked her shoulder, which was rare. Christina didn't usually have time for affection. I loved fairy tales when I was a child, too, her mother said. You did. Molly was surprised. She had never seen her mother with a book in her hands. Really, Christina nodded. In the orphanage sometimes, there were such moments that I wanted to kill myself only with fairy tales and save myself. You're dreaming. The fact that the Chief Stephen is looking after her. Molly, despite her lack of experience, realized quickly. Even a blind woman would have guessed it. Once, when the girl came into his office with papers, he offered her a glass of champagne. It was so unexpected that Molly stared at him, as in that folk saying of leprosy and new gates. Then he invited her to a concert. She said that she was not musical and did not like modern pop at all. What do you like? In his voice, he felt genuine interest. Reading alone, Molly said. Here the topic was already difficult to continue. The chief had to nod and go about his business. But the new colleagues insisted that the boss will not leave the girl alone. I don't like him. Molly fought back. Come on, he's handsome. One of the girls persuaded her, but there's something missing in him, some kind of masculinity. But he's got an ending, pardon the vulgarity. And nobody's trying to convince you to marry him. He won't offer you one. It'll be quiet, but why not let yourself have some fun? Maybe he's taking you to Italy. He took Masha to Italy. Molly got off with a laugh. She was going to the corporate party quite calmly, not even assuming that something extraordinary could happen. She anticipated only a delicious dinner, music, and the opportunity to dance in the cafe. Molly was extremely rare, not the right upbringing. This was supposed to be simple. It'd be an intimate gathering at work. You could stay late, and since everyone would be a little drunk, the girls would call a cab to take them home. And then there were cocktails, which I'd never had before. Surprisingly delicious, except they made me dizzy and lost my sense of reality. And when they were followed by cognac in the chief's office, now I wanted to cry. Why did everything happen so banal, like in a cheap love story? Only there the chief and the gray mouse, his subordinates, in the end, necessarily fall in love with each other, and she gives birth to his son, and even a double or even a triple. Molly, I was thinking about the fact that if she goes to work after the holidays, it will be only to write a letter of resignation. She'll never be able to see Stephen as a man. Some kind of vibe he lacks. And even if he built her a palace and sent her around the world in a ship, it wouldn't make things right. When her work came for her unexpectedly, Molly's mother felt immensely guilty. She knew how much of the three Christina's nerves were already on edge and how important it was to her that her daughter be home on time. "Frosty outside," said Christina, "and you are hyped up. Let's call a cab." That was a rarity too. It wasn't that Christina didn't like spending money on cabs. She realized it was out of her hands. It wasn't hers. It was a way of life. To this day, every penny counts. One could take the bus to get there or walk. To Molly's amazement, the chief didn't leave. Stephen stood by like a lost man. "I'll take you home," he said hastily. And even more astonished was the girl. When her mother simply replied, "Don't, Stephen, you've been drinking. I can smell it a mile away. We'll get there ourselves. Come on, Molly." Stephen didn't sleep that night. At first, he couldn't believe he'd met Christina again, after she'd vanished without a trace all those years ago. It really was like a stone in the water, and he never meant to hurt her. He knew how hard her life was. He sneaked her all the money he had in his purse. He knew she wouldn't take it out of his hand. Maybe she'd find it. She wouldn't be angry right away. Of course, he'd say she wasn't a beggar, but suddenly he'd get angry and keep it for himself. For sure, she had so many needs. He would be ready to help her even then. But it had never occurred to him to propose to her. A whole life already stood between them. Stephen had become a hardened bachelor at heart. The thought of marriage terrified him. He was more than satisfied with the woman who ran his household. Paid, and everything will be done the way he wants. Tired of it, he fired her. And the kids. There's no telling if they would have accepted him or not. Boys are a difficult age, and the sons, God forbid his temper comes out in them. Then it would be impossible to deal with them at all. And then Stephen challenged the idea that it was the girl he liked so much and who was now his mistress. Maybe his daughter, even if he and Christina had only one night together. But what the hell was the joke? He began to frantically remember how many years ago this meeting had taken place, how many years of MAI, and covered himself in cold sweat. Christina herself, well worn by life, looked now about 20 years older than him. But Molly was pretty. Does she look like him or Benjamin? Christina knows, of course, who her father is. But if the irreparable has happened, what is to be done? So far, Stephen has been treated like a table on which there were an inconceivable number of dishes, and the only thing left to do was to choose. Should he not try this one more? He was trying it. New resort, new club, new entertainment, new girls. And now, for the first time in his life, he was scared. Usually when he had a problem, he called his therapist. It was in step with the times, Stephen. And it wouldn't have occurred to you to get alcohol or cry to your friends. No, they're not stupid in the West. There, every well-to-do man goes to his own doctor. The therapist's name was Artur Igorovich. He was the most fashionable in town and expensive. A consultation with him cost a fortune. He was also famous as a dog sled traveler, and that added to his popularity. Women flowed to him, even though at heart he was Gene Hader. And Stephen was impressed by that. At one time, when he told the doctor his story, he blamed Christina for everything and justified the actions of his patient. In addition, he never once said that Stephen should have gotten married. In the therapist's opinion, his client would be happy just by remaining single. But what will he say this time? Can such a criminal mistake be justified? Or was there no mistake at all? Just a pretty despicable act. He took advantage of the inadequacy of a girl who was drunk for the first time, and through his own fault. No, he's gonna have to drink it himself. He'd pick up the phone at 500, then at 6 o'clock. He wanted to call Christina, but realized it was obscenely early. Had he and his daughter even slept that night? What and how had she told her mother? Stephen was holding his head, and at times as heavy as a bear. For the first time in many long years, he remembered the orphanage in his life so vividly. He was ashamed in front of the dead Benjamin. And in front of Christina and her daughter, he couldn't even say what he'd experienced. In the morning, Christina called himself. He saw an unfamiliar number on his cell phone and immediately guessed who it was. Yes, he said, and didn't recognize his voice. He coughed and repeated it. Yes, we need to talk, Christina said. But at any rate, he's not such a coward as to avoid this meeting. When and where? He asked. Apparently, she thought for a few minutes because he hastily suggested. At my work is not worth it. All the same will interfere. But there is a good cafe opposite the office. No, said Christina, and he literally saw her hard grin. I don't want to go to the cafe with you. I'll give you the address. Come to our house and we'll talk. He got the idea that she wanted him to show up as a groom, honor with flowers, and propose. Life had put her through its millstones, but Christina still remained a storyteller. My home would be gone, Christina said. She's gone to a friend's house, but come in the morning. Then I'll leave too. I'll get ready, and Christina hung up. Less than an hour had passed, and he was already outside her house. He didn't remember having been in this neighborhood before. There were old 5-story buildings shy of the dirty courtyard. Of course, no intercom. So Stephen immediately rang the bell at the very door of the apartment on the 3rd floor. In the semi-darkness of the corridor, Christina seemed to him the same. The same small figure, the same dark hair lying on her shoulders. He handed her a luxurious bouquet of white and pink roses. Such gifts to favorite girls, they put them in a bucket, not in a vase. Come in, Christina said. She did put the flowers in a bucket. Probably there were not so many vases in the house to divide them into bouquets, and the skeptical simplicity of a small apartment. And behind the screen door, Stephen's mom's bed must have gotten even grosser on her soul. Christina pointed him to the sofa herself sat opposite, straight, stern. She didn't offer tea or coffee. Christina. He mustered up the courage not to go around. Yes, around. You, I think you've told mine. And I think you know what happened yesterday. She nodded and said nothing more. She didn't come at him with reproach. I was terribly guilty, and I wanted to make my proposal, to ask her to marry me. Marry her she won't regret. I'll do anything to make sure she won't regret it. She'll have everything I can give her. Christina shook her head slowly. Or did he take his hand to his throat? Did he want to help himself to talk? Or is she my daughter? At one time, I didn't know whose daughter she was, Christina said. But when Benjamin died, I pulled myself together and did the test. And she's Molly. Stephen dropped his head to his chest. He could finally breathe. She won't marry you, Christina also said dryly. I'm sorry, Stephen. And rich, and you have a firm and a business. You own factories, newspapers, steamships. But there's just something about you. I couldn't love you. And mine won't either. And you can't really love her. You can't love anyone but yourself. But I ruined her life. Stephen didn't try to get out of it. I could have tried to redeem myself somehow. Isn't that a lot of honor to take on? The last thing he expected was to hear Christina say those words. She'll forget what happened sooner or later. But if she gets involved with you and gives you a piece of her life to run away on a soap heel, yeah, she learned a lesson, albeit a hard one, but it's just a lesson. It's not a tragedy. So what do you want me to do for her? Stephen asked, and then he added, and for you too. You realize that she will leave your firm now, Christina said. The girl has no connections. It will be hard for her. If you help her, not because of what you did, but in memory of our former friendship. You remember how we were friends with Benjamin, all 3 of us. That's probably fair. You know, third hand somehow, and she won't take you. Did you tell Molly about us? He asked. Christina nodded. Yes, she and I have always been and will always be honest with each other. It's not easy for her right now, but she'll recover. She may look weak, but she is strong. What can you do for me? Take me to the train station. You're leaving. Fear has awakened in him again. Of what? Of me. Where are you going? To the train station, Christina repeated. It leaves in an hour and a half. Just then, he noticed a wheeled bag in the corner. Let's go, he said, standing up. The car is downstairs. On the way, he tried to ask her about how she had lived all these years, about her children. I'm sorry, Christina said. The subject is closed to our lives. I don't want to let you in. For a few minutes they drove in silence. And I take it you're still single. Christina was staring at herself, and it looks like I'm not going to have anything serious in my life. Christina, I will not ask you about yours, but you have always been great, as it is said, about the soul of the soul and poison. She interjected, having heard it more than once. You always knew what was in everyone's soul. I could predict what was going to happen next. Tell me, please, am I going to be alone in life like this? What do they say about women? A celibate veil. Am I wearing a crown or something? Why is my love life not working out? He asked, but he kind of knew her answer. Now she would say, because you don't need anyone yourself. Can you get married? Said Christina tiredly. Just don't be under any illusions that you'll be loved. If you openly see that a girl is attracted to your money, marry the one you want. But why such a girl? Because only soulmates make a good family. Christina shrugged. If you want someone to look over you in your old age, make a marriage contract and live with your eyes open. You and your spouse have a business arrangement. You her youth, beauty full of obedience, like in the East. And for her, a life of luxury while you're alive, and a bank account. After you're dead, Majorca was 100 times worse than me. Did you love him? Who told you he was worse? Yes, he drank himself to death, but he knew how to love when he was young. And you don't have that in you. Absolutely. That's how people don't have the gift of music, or can't draw. You can't fight it. You can't make it work. When they arrived at the station for train 3, they were already boarding. Where are you going? Once again he asked, already not hoping that she would answer him. But Christina answered to her eldest son to John's apartment, leaving Molly behind. If she wants to, she'll stay in town. If she wants to, she'll move. I've never stood in the way of my children. And he needs me now. I can feel it in my heart. He's out in the middle of nowhere. I have to take a train, then a bus. John works as a forester. He lives in a cabin with no facilities. That doesn't scare me. We've been there, but we need to warm our hearts right now. He and me and him. Did he call you? No, he won't. I can just feel it. I told you, you called me. How's that for a soul? Christina climbed up on the step of the carriage. Stephen helped her lift her bag. She nodded and went straight inside. The train had already pulled away from the platform, and Stephen followed it. For some reason, he waited for Christina to come out into the vestibule, and they would look at each other, and the snow would fly, covering her black hair and white, similar shawl.